Alright guys, BLM here back with a new video, and in this video we're back with another retrospective for a Genius season. This being the final retrospective, at least of the Korean show. Us being a retrospective season 4, the final season of the Genius Grand Final. An all-star season of the show that I think is a very fitting way for the show to conclude. While the Genius is again one of the best reality shows ever created, and I do think it's a shame that we didn't get more of it, I do think the fact that it ended after season 4, and season 4 ends up being in this big all-star season that ends up feeling like a very fitting conclusion, again, is a very apt way for the show to go, even though the season itself is a little bit mixed in retrospect. I think there was a point where I looked at Grand Final as my favorite season of the show. However, I do think as time goes on, my opinion of the season as a whole probably goes down a bit. I actually think in many ways, I think of it in a similar way to how I look at Winners at War from Survivor, in the sense that it's maybe not the greatest season of the show it's supposed to be a part of, yet I feel like it's a good celebration of the series as a whole. I feel like this season, obviously, again, is a returnee season, has a lot of callbacks to previous seasons, and follows up on many things from previous seasons in a very satisfying way. And I feel like because that the Genius Grand Final ends up being a season that feels probably better than the actual sum of its parts, where I think the reality is that there's probably some slower points in the season. I think the season probably has less fun character moments than previous seasons. Yeah, it's still a season of the Genius, and it's still, again, a pretty well executed one, even though, again, we'll have some criticisms along the way. But either way, like my other retrospectives, I'll be running through the season from beginning to end, talking about my opinions along the way. So let's start off with episode 1, which I think is probably one of the best Genius episodes of all time. It is such an incredible opening episode for the season that really has everything that you would want from it. And obviously seeing the return of all these players, having some great reveals during the main match, and having a pretty solid death match. So all around, I think this is one of the best episodes in the show's history. And I really love the opening sequence of this episode as well. It's actually probably one of my favorite sequences in any reality show. I've watched just the opening 10 minutes of this show, possibly more than any other sequence of any other reality show, where just something about it just really clicks to me. Just building a lot of hype for the season. But it does start off with, again, a very long, dramatic, cinematic intro with this somber music and shots of wreckage as we get credits, only for a TV to turn on, and it's Bandage Man. We start to get the song Right Here, Right Now by Fatboy Slim playing as he ends up obviously introducing the show. Again, 13 players here who are experienced in the Genius, and it's showing clips from previous seasons until we eventually just see the entire cast in a preseason photo shoot that is kind of strange, as again they try to act as if people are surprised when they see each other when they actually start the game, when it's again, you already knew the cast. But also, I've always laughed at this really humorous shot throughout all this as we get B-roll during the photo shoot, and there's just this weird clip of Hyunmin just clapping in a very over the top way that I always found very funny. But either way, Bandage Man ends this by saying victory cannot be achieved in the same way, which I don't know if that's true in any case about this season. Anyway, we then get introduced to the set going room by room, which not important to me, but that is until we get our first player arriving, that being Jinho, with Extreme Ways playing in this moment, which this is part of this introduction sequence that I do really love. I do love, again, players entering one by one, just getting this kind of intro to them, showing clips from previous seasons, giving them nicknames, showing these title cards of how many main match and death matches they win, them having their own individual theme songs playing, and all this is just so hype, and again, really a fun way to introduce the cast. Though, again, Jinho being the first in here makes, again, a lot of sense. Being, again, the Genius icon at this point. Though, following him, we do end up seeing Sangmin enter, with Bangarang playing at that point. And, again, the legend behind 7 consecutive main match wins, which is, a little bit questionable considering one of them wasn't technically a win. But either way, obviously, again, great to see Sangmin back here as well. Again, obviously, there was no doubt that Jinho and Sangmin were not going to be on this season. And that's followed by the other winner on the board. We got Dongmin entering, with Centuries playing, and his title card being an extra sensory player that dominates the game. But again, this being just such a great way to open this season, having the 3 winners of the show being the first to enter here and all interacting together, which, to be fair, we technically saw this during season 3, but again, that was before Dongmin actually won. And now, again, starting off this all-star season with all the winners here was cool to see, and we instantly see Jinho talking about wanting to create a winners alliance that Dongmin just laughs off because, again, surely the winners won't be working together. But I did also love the banter that we do get here with Dongmin noticing that the locker from season 3 is gone, only for Sangmin to say that he didn't watch season 3 and tells Jinho, do you have any self-respect? Leading to this big debate over which is the best season, where Dongmin says that seasons 1 and 2 were simulations, only for Sangmin to say season 2 was a war, which was it? And that season 3 was all about harmony. When Dongmin frowned, they backed down, which is like, I mean, I thought you didn't watch season 3. Anyway, that's when we get the next player entering, which ends up being Hyunmin, with him being labeled as creating genius solutions that surpass the champions, which, was that supposed to be a dig at Dongmin? But again, Hyunmin being next to enter, again, being the best to never win, I thought was being, again, the perfect next person to enter. We do instantly see them all trying to pull him into their alliances, with Jinho telling him he thought he was going to win, only for Sangmin to pull him over with Dongmin and saying that they're the 3 Mins, leaving out Jinho, only for Jinho to pull them all together and say that they should be an alliance called Jang Lee Oh Hong, just their last names, which makes no sense. And then this leads to them realizing that all the Mins in their names are different characters, and they laugh it off, which obviously would be a lot funnier if I was Korean. Anyway, we then get the next player to enter, which ends up being Kyungran, labeled as the Genius's greatest female player, which sure. But again, another kind of lock to be on this cast, and another runner-up here. But here we have Dongmin saying that the female players from season 3 were so nice, leading to Kyungran being upset, that implying that she's not nice, with Sangmin saying, careful, she's strong. And again, all this, again, weird. We're just continuing this, like, stereotype of, like, Kyungran being this, like, kind of cold-hearted player, which, again, like, is definitely not the vibe I really get from her coming out of season 1. But we do get Jinho talking here about how the internet loves her, and Kyungran ends up being shocked in a spot where it really feels like Kyungran, like, did not do any research coming into the season. Where it seemed like she clearly did not watch season 3, did not know who any of those people are. And season 2 even, it probably only knew some of those people because she made a guest appearance on the season. And really outside that, again, it feels like Kyungran, someone that just simply did not follow the show and being involved in any of the community following the season. It's following this that we have Jinho stuttering, and they make fun of it because we still need to have that in the show. Anyway, Dongmin ends up saying that they're like the Avengers, where, again, this was kind of peak time for the Avengers, I believe the time around Age of Ultron. We get the Avengers theme playing with the title card, We Are Avengeniuses, coming on screen, which is very cringy, probably my least favorite part of this entire intro. That's only for a new hero to enter, that being Yohwan, where the music just stops and everyone ends up being disappointed. Though again, with Yohwan entering here, again, this ends up being all the runner-ups now on the cast, which again is a cool little touch there. But I do find it funny how much the Genius just kind of dunks on Yohwan at every opportunity, saying in his title card that he went from Emperor to Icon of Servility, and he had a miraculous 0 Garnet run and 0 main match wins. But following this, we start to speed up the players' introductions here, weirdly then getting to Junsok, the unfortunate first round elimination. We also obviously getting jokes around his relationship with Jinho and him flinching when Jinho tries to talk to him, and us getting a flashback to him eliminating him, which, again, nice callback there. But also, again, Junsuk being on this cast is obviously weird. Again, the first boot of the show ever ends up being back on an all-star season, and obviously Junsuk ends up being kind of problematic in the modern day. But I mean, in terms of his casting on the season, it's not necessarily like a bad choice in terms of TV. Obviously, again, he's someone that is very chaotic and plays the games in an interesting way, and beyond that also obviously still has that legacy as the first ever eliminated player, and to be fair, had a good reappearance in season 2, to where Junsuk's just someone that, like, I probably would have not cast him personally. If I were to make my own cast, yeah, I do kind of understand why he's here, and I do think he actually plays a pretty decent role on the season. With that, we then jump into the next player, which ends up being Yoohyun. And at this point, players are just coming in and random more, where I was like, that's something I was disappointed by, in the sense that technically all the third placers are on the season as well. So I would have liked it if they just did a third placers up there, second placers, and really just in general. I think it would have been cool if they just did everybody in order of how far they made it, as I do feel like it actually turns out to be a pretty decent order. Yeah, again, they didn't go that route, and at this point, just kind of random. But anyway, Yoohyun is next to enter, with his introduction just having like multiple phrases on the screen that supposedly people were saying about him in the online community, which are mostly ridiculous, like calling him married man Kim, and well-informed, and deliberate deathmatch sender, star-crossed Dongmin lover, and my favorite of which being same age as Yeonju, which again, what a great description of him. And we do see right away that he does have a connection to Yohwan through being poker players, which doesn't play much of a factor on the season. Only for us to then cut to the next player entering with no new music, which I found very funny. That being Jungmoon, the only person to not get her own theme song. And obviously, I think that the casting of Jun Moon here is probably the one that I'm the most questionable on. I do feel like Jun Moon just is someone that didn't really bring that much to her original season. Like, she was fine, but just not someone that would have been a top priority to bring back. I do think, especially amongst the women of the Genius, I think Ah Young is someone that I believe was not asked for the season. I feel like she would have been a lot more interesting, even though obviously Ah Young's maybe not the greatest player, but again, at least she's a great character. And I feel like, and also it's not like Jung Moon's the greatest player either. So I think Jung Moon's casting here is one that I'm probably the most questionable on, even though, again, obviously this ends up being a spot here where it ends up only being the second woman to enter in a spot where there's only 3 women on this cast, which is obviously something very questionable. And I would say in general, that is a major criticism of the casting of this season, really just casting of the Genius, is that obviously just gender divide has never been particularly equal, and it's just been getting worse and worse season after season. And on this season, it feels like they just didn't bother. And again, considering Jung Moon is one of 3 women to be on the cast here, and really it's a spot where of the 3 women on the cast, Jung Moon is the only person to even make it to the halfway point of their original season. Is just, again, kind of sad that they didn't go for more women on this cast. And again, I don't know about the entire casting process of the Genius Grand Final to know if their players said yes or no. Yeah, I do think it's a spot here where the fact that we only get 3 women on this cast, and again, 2 of them are early boots, just feels a bit pathetic. Especially when knowing that like someone like Dahae was someone that they called and wanted to decline, which again just feels like such a random pick. Where I find it very strange how, again, they primarily focused around these women that were earlier boots over, again, women that made it much deeper into the game. But again, Jung Moon here gets labeled as the greatest final helper because she helped Jinho win. To which we do get some humor from Kyungran initially being very happy to see another woman there, only to be reminded that Jung Moon helped Jinho win instead of her. And it also leads to this like weird moment of Dongman saying that he wanted to meet her because she's sweet, and shows him blushing for some reason. Either way, after that, Yunsung ends up coming into the game. The steely mentality that dreamed of revenge, which I thought was a really funny description, with Everyone Wants to Rule the World playing, where I thought this was a pretty good intro for him. And again, just kind of a solid pick here for this cast. Though again, he comes in talking about his acupuncture, with everyone saying it's overpowered, I guess. And we get the final woman coming in, that being Yunsun, who, again, as much as I criticize the casting earlier, Yunsun actually I think is a pretty good pick here. I mean, even though she, again, was a relatively early boot on her season, she still had a pretty major impact on her season, and was a player that played the game in a really fun way. And again, she gets described here as a passionate player that longs for victory. So we then proceed to see her instantly have a target on her back with Jinho saying that she's dangerous, with Kyungran calling him out for only saying that about the women, which, fair. But then we get a big reaction for the next player that enters, which ends up being Junghyun, the veteran fighting spirit that comes to life like a phoenix. Again, another one fun to see back here as this joke player that also turned out to actually be somewhat decent at the game. We do get set up here for his rivalry with Yohwan. He's annoyed that he has to stand next to him, which doesn't really lead to anything. But then we get talk about who is the 13th player, as if they don't already know. But I will say, I remember when watching this live, I very much thought it was going to be Sungyu. I just thought it was kind of a no-brainer that obviously Sungyu would be this final pick here, only for the reveal that it's Kyunghoon, the second boot from Season 3, which I remember being very disappointed in, especially considering, again, you would think that they would be really hyping up this final player to enter the game, only for it to be Kyunghoon. And obviously, in retrospect, Kyunghoon ends up being a really fun presence on this season, again, being labeled here as the unpredictable game destroyer, and we have this like meme music playing as he enters, and Dongmin says that today you'll learn that the world has a character like this. And again, a really fun introduction here for Kyunghoon, but in a spot where, again, I do think his casting here feels a little bit weird for an all-star season, but again, it's kind of similar to Junsok in a spot where, again, it's an early boot, but it is one that's going to cause chaos and play in a fun way, to where there is definitely a reason for him to be here. Though I think unlike Junsok, who has that legacy as being the first ever boot, Kyunghoon doesn't really have that, though, and he did obviously have such a big splash on the last season, and again, a big flame out, to where I get why he's cast here, and he obviously brings a lot to the season, yet it just feels like a choice that feels very strange on paper. Though again, obviously going back to the Sungyu of it all, obviously Sungyu was supposedly asked to do the season and couldn't do it due to time commitments, which fair considering he's obviously a bigger celebrity. Also, I do know Youngkyul was supposedly somebody that was offered a spot in the cast and had declined, where I do very much question, like, why Youngkyul? Again, that just feels like such a random pick. Where supposedly, again, he was a much bigger character during the actual games than what he ended up being in the edit, though also, again, it's the producers deciding the edit. So it's like, if that is the case, why didn't they just make him a better character on the show? To where, ultimately, again, I just find it bizarre that he was someone that was supposedly very close to being on this season, considering him being such a minor character in the show's history. Supposedly the producers really wanted him, and I assume he probably would have taken the spot of Kyunghoon, considering they kind of fit the same archetype. To which, in that sense, again, I'm actually happier that Kyunghoon is on the cast than Youngkyul personally. And again, as much as I criticize this cast beforehand, I do think this is actually still a pretty good good cast, again, especially considering they only had 3 seasons of the show to work with, and they're already being returning players even on those later 2 seasons. Again, considering the very limited pool of players to get, I feel like they actually put together a pretty decent cast. Again, I would have obviously tried to even out the genders a bit better. I would have personally went with players that probably made it a bit deeper over some like really early boots, considering that is like a weird aspect of this cast, the fact that this cast is essentially comprised of literally every player that made the final 3, which is kind of insane on paper. But then following that, it has a pretty big drop off where, again, you have Yoo Hyun, who made 5th place, but after that, it's all players that didn't even make it halfway through the game. And again, I think that's a very strange dynamic of this cast, as realistically, there should be this like David versus Goliath sort of dynamic there. And I do think it's kind of an understated aspect of the season, in the fact that a lot of the top dogs end up working together on this season, while a lot of the other players are kind of left on the bottom. Yeah, it's something that's never really that focused on. Yeah, I feel like it's something that clearly seemed to be happening here. But anyway, we end up building to the intro with Sangmin talking about prize money and how they should steal lots of garnets, which is finally followed up by Jung Hyun calling him out for his hypocrisy and using so many garnets in season 2. But anyway, the dealers end up coming in with Dongwon continuing his friend gimmick again, which again is kind of funny in retrospect that literally half the series ends up having this by the end. But anyway, Banjman shows up to go over the rules, mostly in line with season 3, though the reveal of garnet matches, that 3 of the 11 main matches will be garnet matches, where the winning player will be the person that has the most garnets by the end of that match, while the loser will be the player with the least. Jinho instantly calling out that this is because of Yohwan, which I think is probably the case, which I do think is actually a good addition to the game. Ozzy ends up adding more of this dilemma of whether or not you should be using garnets at specific points, and allows for more garnets to be in circulation, and again feels like a follow-up on the final main match from the previous season, which was essentially a garnet match, which I think is probably where they created this concept. And ultimately, again, I think it's a nice addition to the game. I probably would have spaced them out a little bit differently, as we'll talk about, but I do like that it also adds more incentive for you to win, as obviously winning main matches gives you garnets, and that gives you advantage later in the game. And while again I do think there's still the issue of it maybe being a bit OP, where obviously again if this was the case in season 2, Sangmin would probably just have an automatic win for most of the season because he had the most garnets, and there's that potential power imbalance there. I do think for how it works out on this season, I think it mostly works out in a good way. I think is a pretty good addition to the game. But following that, we also get the reveal of how death matches will be handled on this season, where they'll be made up of games from the past, which I really like. Obviously, again, having callbacks to previous seasons, each of these death matches being played once, allowing for there to be a different one every episode. And I do think most of the picks here make a lot of sense. Again, a lot of the typical suspects, though, and I think there's some questionable ones here and there, where we get the reveal of Tactical Inori, Indian Poker, Yo-Hap, Same Picture Hunt, Quattro, Black and White, Betting Rock Paper Scissors, 12 Jongi, Double-Sided Poker, Monorail, and Same Number Hunt. Again, I think all very solid picks here, pretty much being all the more iconic death matches in the show's history, where the ones that weren't picked here, again, are like Winning Streak, which while iconic and not very geniusy in the grand scheme of things, and you have like games that are kind of broken, like Image Game and Laser Chess and Blackout Game and Truth Detector, which are all just not particularly interesting. Again, for games like Sun Moon Star and Indian Hold'em, you have like improved versions of them already there, of like Betting Rock Paper Scissors and again like the other poker games. The ones I'm a little bit more questionable in them not being here are Black and White 2, where I think for me personally, Black and White 2 is one of my favorite death matches, if not my favorite death match of all time, and I think for it to not be on this season feels a bit strange. Memory Maze is also a challenge I did not love, though another one that would have at least fit being here, though again I'm kind of fine with it not being here. And also Betting Black and White is also kind of surprising it's not here, though to be fair, obviously it was meant to make an appearance in the final, so again maybe that's what they were keeping that for. But all this, again, really cool in how this is handled, and the fact that each deathmatch candidate gets to veto some of the death matches, only for it to be a random draw amongst those not vetoed, which again I think a really cool concept there. And again, I really like how all this is handled, outside the fact that it's kind of broken, as it really obviously allows players to know what the potential future death matches are, especially as we get later on in the season, which allows for players to obviously prepare for these death matches, which leads to certain players really just specifically preparing for these specific death matches and getting very good at them, as we'll later see. Anyway, we get introduced to the first main match here, that being ID Exchange, a game where you have to trade your ID card with another player to get a point, and the player with the most points by the end wins, where randomly there are going to be 7 commoners, 5 nobles, and 1 convict distributed, where if you end up trading for a noble, you end up getting a point. However, the foil to all this is the convict, where giving that away gives you 2 points, where also the last to trade away the convict gets 3 points, aka a near guaranteed win in most given situations. Though obviously the big downside to all this is the player that holds the convict at the end of the game is the loser, which I think is a really interesting game here. Now, I do actually feel like more times than not, this is a game that probably plays out as well as how good the cast is, where it's a game that really just allows for you to play passively, where you don't really have any incentive to do anything unless you want to win here, where, again, if you know that you don't have the convict, if you just don't do anything, you're not going to lose. And I think that's an issue. Also, again, if you have a majority that doesn't have the convict, then you could just essentially give a joint win to that alliance fairly easily, as we'll later see. And I feel like that's also a major issue here, where, again, it's just a game that's very easy for you to ice out certain players. Mind you, obviously, this is a cast that has these very self-interested players, these players that are going to be making moves to give themselves the win. And again, that is something that is really the true test of this game. I think you need players that are willing to betray others and screw people over with a convict card. And that is really the main decider on if this game is going to play out well or not. Otherwise, I think it's, again, a game that's just very easy for a majority to just kind of steamroll. But it kind of plays out in the best possible way here. But anyway, we get our flash forward for the episode kind of 3 hours later, where Sangmin is portrayed to be upset, saying, "We had an agreement, didn't we?" And we see him sitting on the ground, sad, saying that this is what a real convict looks like. Where, again, obviously, the show trying to imply that he's stuck with the convict card and he's about to go home. And we see Jinho saying that there's too many weird people on season 4. And, all of this obviously just being very misleading, which, again, is the best type of flash forward. But anyway, we start to see some alliances forming here. First with Hyunmin being on his own, only for Kyunghoon to enter the room. And we get a flashback to them arguing in season 3 with Hyunmin asking if he can get a restraining order. And it is funny that we do see Kyunghoon literally bring up the strategy that he could just do nothing, only for that to be scolded by both Hyunmin and the show. Even though that's probably how most of the people in GCUK would have probably played this. But anyway, we see Kyunghoon then joining an alliance with Junsuk, Yoonsun, and Yohwan, aka kind of the outsiders here, with him promising to not betray this time, where he wants to get rid of his traitor image and become the icon of honesty, which he gets off to a great start by instantly talking to Dongmin and agreeing to work together and play both sides, which surely won't get him into any trouble. Also, you see Dongmin and Jinho agreeing to work together, with them deciding to pull in Yunsong, as he won't backstab anybody, to which they have a plan to bring in one person each. So it's funny that they have this kind of like brigade-style strategy just to not fully go through with it. But that's when we get a lot of focus around what Sangmin is doing in this episode. First pulling in all the winners, saying, let's not embarrass each other. And we need to share the absolute truth with each other like champions, because Sangmin surely does that. Oh, then he also ends up pulling Hyunmin for an alliance, with Hyunmin being excited to be Sangmin's advisor and giving him his heart, I guess. But he ends up then adding in Kyungran and Jungmoon to the alliance as well, with a lot of focus on Sangmin's relationship with Kyungran, which obviously has a lot of history there. By the end, they end up adding in Junghoon into the alliance as well to have a 5-person alliance there. All the game officially starts where they're given their ID cards in a spot where the only way to see the identity of the cards is through a black light, though we do see players instantly trying to check the cards for a trick, though aren't able to find one. But we do get some players getting their roles revealed, with Sangmin taking extra care to keep his secret, or I wonder what that means. But right away, we do see Sangmin then proceeding to pull in Jinho, to which they then merge their alliances to just make a massive majority here, now essentially making it 9 versus 4, and they instantly create the strategy of using unofficial trades to give a joint win to the alliance, which is obviously the optimal play, but also, again, kind of the downsides of this game. This is when we start to get the big reveal here, where Sangmin pulls over Hyungmin to tell him that he has the convicts. Again, obviously flashing back to him finding out, though, again, nothing gets followed up on this just yet, which I actually do kind of like how this is portrayed here, and the fact that we find out that Sangmin has the convict, but not necessarily shown what he does with it until a little bit later, as we then start to follow Kyunghoon, who is obviously struggling with trying to stick with his alliance, but trying to stick with Dongmin. Who would have guessed? Where Dongmin tells him that he can't lose his commoner card, leading to Kyunghoon struggling as he can't trade with his alliance because he can't get rid of his commoner card, leading to his alliance being annoyed with him, where it's almost as if Kyunghoon's a terrible ally. But we see Kyunghoon being pulled away, only for him to come back and now start trading with his alliance, trading with Yohwan, only for a reveal that Kyunghoon traded away the convict. With us getting the flashback reveal now, the Sangmin having swapped cards with Kyunghoon, making him think it was a noble, where Kyunghoon, again, did legitimately think that he was trading a noble in this spot, so he wouldn't trade away his, which is still technically him screwing over his alliance, because this would be a world where he's still not giving his alliance a point. But either way, obviously this all being Sangmin just successfully getting rid of the convict here, to which he ends up instantly revealing to his alliance what happened. And at this point, again, the majority can just safely go for a joint win here, knowing where the convict is, and just ice out the other side, which again is an issue of this game's design. But we do get a funny moment here from Yohwan confronting Kyunghoon, only for Kyung-hoon to be confused until it just clicks in his head finally that he must have been tricked into giving away the convict card, to which it's at this point where Kyung-hoon decides to take it back and tells Yohwan to not tell anybody, seemingly at this point trying to trick someone else into trading it away, though again it's kind of too late at this point, where again really the problem at this point is that the majority doesn't really have any incentive to trade with him. Again, they just have the trade within each other and already given the win at that point, where again him just taking back the convict card at this point just kind of screws him over. And again we instantly see Yohwan telling Hyunmin his role, which isn't directly obviously telling him that Kyung-hoon has the convict, though obviously implies it, to where at this point the majority knows that Kyung-hoon has the convict again. So it's at this point where we just see the majority realize that, well, we don't need to ice out Yeon-sun and Jun-sok, considering we know exactly where the convict is, to where they end up being pulled into the alliance. To where now the plan is just to create an 11-person tie to make it so Yohwan and Kyung-hoon automatically go into the death match. Again, how fun. But we end up seeing the majority here just swapping between the same two cards through unofficial trades, though this is where we do get some intrigue from Jun-sok coming into the picture, with him talking to Kyung-hoon, wanting to make a deal so that he can get a soul win here by taking the convict and being the last to trade it. Though we do see Sangmin and Hyunmin noticing this and not trusting him because of it. They say because of this, we have to give Jun-sok the points first. I guess, like if anything, just not give him the points at all, because you don't even need to have to do that. And we do see Jun-sok going through with the initial trades, getting points, only for him to stop and take the card with him. Again, I never expected that would happen, that he would mess up the majority's plans. So this ends up being the moment of the flash forward, where we see people being pissed at Jun-sok and Sangmin on the ground on his own. With, again, Jinho saying there's so many weird people in season 4. Jung-hyun being upset at Jun-sok leaving people behind, saying that he will die in the next round, which again is surely not foreshadowing. And I love how this is all for naught, considering Kyung-hoon never ends up actually giving Jun-sok the convict card, though again we'll later see why. But this is leading to a lot of confusion here over what cards are what due to all the unofficial trades, to where we end up really just having to test out 2 cards and just hope that they're the correct ones, which they're able to do. So again, that kind of led to nothing. But again, Sangmin ends up leading the following trades here, getting some points. Only the trade with Jungmoon, who immediately then gives her card to Jung-hoon, who's meant to then trade with Sangmin, only for Sangmin to stop as well, with more chaos being caused here. There being less than a minute left on the clock, where we do get this great reveal here as Jung-hoon says that he thinks Sangmin is stopping because he has the convict and feels bad for giving it away to him, only for Sangmin to pull him over and say, I'm sorry, it's the opposite. With this obviously being this great reveal for this episode, flashing back to Sangmin making a deal with Kyung-hoon while this entire Jun-sok situation was happening, in which Kyung-hoon ends up giving Sangmin the convict card he had in his pocket the entire time, which I would say feels a little bit questionable, the fact that you're allowed to have 2 cards on you anytime, especially in a spot where, again, you're trading cards with another card on you. And again, it obviously leads to a fun TV moment here. I do feel like it feels like a weird ruling here, as, again, how do you really determine who has the convict card in that case? Or due to all the unofficial trades, I think it can lead to some wonkiness if people can, again, theoretically have no cards by the end of the game. But either way, Sangmin ends up talking about how he did this move because he was sus of Jun-sok, and if Jun-sok was going to screw him over, he would get nothing. So again, he might as well do it himself, to where, again, it is fun that we literally see as Jun-sok is walking away with the card and causing all this chaos, that Sangmin pulls Jung-hoon over to the side. And we do end up seeing Yoo-hyun be highlighted here as noticing Sangmin swapping out the card, though that doesn't lead to anything. But obviously we get a slew of people being annoyed at Sangmin here. But in typical Sangmin fashion, it doesn't end up negatively affecting him in the game. And it is also funny here that, again, obviously he does initially trade it to Jungmoon at first, who ends up quickly handing it over to Jung-hoon, which I'll say, again, is a bit of a weird aspect of this, the fact that Jung-hoon didn't even do an official trade for the convict. He's just, handed it kind of randomly here. It also makes me question, was Sangmin trying to screw over Jungmoon in this spot, where he could have done this really at any time, though he seemed to decide on Jungmoon being the person to screw over specifically, which is weird considering, Jungmoon was one of the first people he pulled into his alliance. But anyway, all this, again, obviously a great reveal for the first episode of the season, again, just being another one of these great Sangmin moments, with him really just not losing a step. So while we don't obviously get that much of Sangmin on this season by the end, I think this is really his highlight moment on the season. But I mean, you do get the results where obviously Sangmin ends up winning here with 8 points, and through that ends up getting 2 garnets, while everyone else in the game outside of Kyung-hoon and Yohwan, who again were left out of the majority alliance, and getting 1 garnet. And we do see Sangmin proceeding to give Hyunmin the token of life, to which she's surprised by. And we do see Jung-hoon now being the deathmatch candidate. And again, I never have guessed that he's going to pick Jun-sok, the person he talked negatively about earlier. I can't believe it. Though, again, a pretty brutal pick here. Again, picking the first boot again for the first death match. Mind you, again, I think it leads to an actually interesting aspect of the season. Again, it being this kind of redemption for Junsok, but still a spot where the thing that Junsok could have almost been a first boot twice is a bit humorous. But anyway, we do get to the deathmatch selection. With both getting exclude 3 games, Junghoon probably correctly ends up excluding Galhap, same picture hunt and same number hunt, all more heady games that Junsok would be good at. All Junsok ends up excluding all the games that require other players, like betting rock, paper, scissors, Quattro, and Tactical Nori, which also is, again, pretty fair for him. So again, the deathmatch ends up being black and white, which I think is, again, just the perfect venue for what's about to come. Again, being what eliminated Junghoon in his first appearance, but also being a game that Junghoon has also won. So through that, again, he has a lot of experience coming in this game, all for Junsok. Obviously, again, him being tested in the first ever deathmatch. Again, this is kind of what I'm saying about this season, that I do think, while, again, I think the season probably doesn't hit as hard as some of the earlier seasons and some of the earlier moments from earlier seasons, I think it is moments like this that do just feel like such a poetic way to end the series, where it just feels like it satisfies so many storylines here, where we get probably one of my favorite death matches of all time, where we do see Junghoon coming into this, talking about his experience in the previous season, and talks about wanting to avenge his loss against Yohwan by using Yohwan's strategy here. Essentially trying to use the strategy that he lost to, thinking that will lead to his redemption here, only for Junsok to just completely outplay him here. Again, getting an early lead and proceeding to use low tiles, the goat out Junghoon's high tiles, to where he ties it back up, though we get the reveal that by round 4 that Junsok already knows that he's won, where we flash back to Junghoon and be using his 6 and 7s, while Junsok still has all of his high tiles, which lead to Junsok winning here, which again, I thought was a great resolution to this episode. Again, having Junsok again get redemption for his first season, all again having this tragic downfall for Junghoon, him trying to redeem himself for his last appearance by essentially utilizing the strategy that lost to him, only for someone to completely counter that strategy against him, which again I think is a tragic but also satisfying exit for Junghoon here. And Junghoon obviously didn't get much to do on this season. He was only in this one episode, and the episode was more so focused around, again, the likes of Sangmin and Kyunghoon, and even Junsok than him. Yeah, despite that, again, he's still a fun presence while he's there. Some of that, again, felt very fitting to be on this season. Yeah, also some of that, again, did feel like someone that was probably a bit out of his depths here, where it did feel like he was probably one of the players with the least amount of potential coming in this season. Yeah, still a pretty interesting appearance from him, despite that. Now for episode 2, going from, again, one of the best episodes in the Geniuses history to one that's just kind of middle of the road. But either way, we do start off with a lot of focus on Kyunghoon and how people are realizing how chaotic of a player he is. So I get this like weird segment of people like trying to get away from him because they don't want to be on the same team as him, in the case that they create teams by who's standing next to each other, I guess. But also, by the end of this, we get him declaring himself as Sangmin's dog, which will never get brought up again. And beyond this, we also see Dongmin, hey, that wouldn't it be funny if it was dog versus owner in a death match, which again will surely never happen. But anyway, we get to the second main match, which ends up being a Garnet match here, which is very surprising to happen so early and is something that I really don't like. I do feel like this ends up putting so much precedence into the first main match, where obviously, again, people that got more garnets in that first main match end up having such a big advantage in the second main match. And considering that this is also a main match that there ultimately wasn't that much room to lose or gain garnets, it felt like a spot here where you just had a massive advantage having more garnets coming out of that first main match, and also a massive disadvantage if you came out with the least amount. With Sangmin always being poised for success here, while Kyunghoon and Yohwan end up coming into this in a pretty poor position. But anyway, the game itself ends up being Horror Race, a race where they have to back characters, which are monster types, where each monster is correlated to a certain colored coin, with Vampire being red, Jiangshi being blue, Gumiho being yellow, Mummy being white, and Zombie being green. To which, from this point on, I'm just going to call them by their colors, as again, I'm not going to bother trying to repronounce those. But anyway, each player ends up getting all 5 coins at the beginning of the game, yet again, can only back 2 of them, to which when they do so, those 2 are removed from the rotation, while the other 3 coins they don't select are added to a box, where each player has to randomly draw for 3 coins that they utilize to put on the 1, 2, or 4 squares that the character with the most at the end of the round ends up moving that number of spaces, which ends up being a really interesting game here, one that obviously leads to you having to coordinate, you picking coins that other people won't take so that there's enough coins in the box for you to move your character, though there's an interesting counter to that as well, in the fact that if there is a tie in a square between multiple coins, those coins get eliminated and the next most ends up moving instead, which obviously adds a lot more strategy to where you put these coins, and also puts a lot more precedent into whoever goes last is obviously they get to make that final decision, which they also add in another mechanic here of you being able to pass on your turn, the opportunity to go last in the next turn, which obviously is kind of just the optimal strat to do. But again, a game I actually do really like, especially when it's with this many people, where it was utilizing Genius UK a lot later into the game, and I feel like it was just not as interesting there with a lot less coins involved. I feel like here, again, I think it ends up being a pretty interesting game, even though, again, I don't love its positioning as a garnet match, as, again, it's a spot here where the only garnets that you end up getting here is, again, if the character you back comes in first, you get 3 garnets. If the character you back gets in second, you get 2 garnets, and if a character you back gets third, you get 1 garnet. And considering many people end up just picking the exact same characters, as, again, obviously you're incentivized to be working in alliances and having the same vested interests, it essentially just leads to a lot of people in the game just getting the same amount of garnets by the end, which again just leaves very little room for people to actually move up on the totem pole. But right away here, we do end up seeing Sangmin regathering his 4-person alliance from the previous round, which is kind of funny considering Jungmoon's still in a spot where he almost sent Jungmoon home, but they end up having the plan here to try to get a joint win. Them later bring in Dongmin into this alliance as well, where there is a funny little moment here of Sangmin saying to him that we need people we can trust, only for Dongmin to just make a funny face. But beyond that, we also do see Dongmin and Youngmin trying to talk here alone, with Kyunghoon being in the room and just not leaving, leading to them eventually kicking him out. Leading the content about Kyunghoon being upset at people not accepting him, which definitely won't be repeated for the next few episodes. So it does lead to him starting to follow Sangmin around, only for Sangmin to tell him to join a separate alliance, which I wonder if that's part of any plan. But he ends up finding an alliance when Jinho creates an alliance of those in the middle, an alliance of him, Yoo-hyun, Kyunghoon, and Junsok. Yeah, really like the underdogs, I guess. And they end up later bringing in Yohwan, with him just struggling to find people to talk to. Or I will say, again, as much as I do defend Yohwan as a player in Season 2, I do feel like in Season 4, he just really felt out of his depth here. And I think it really just exemplified the major issues of Yohwan as a player, and the fact that he just has a tough time in these social aspects of the game, where we do get this very awkward moment of him trying to work with Youngmin, only for Youngmin to be completely unresponsive to it. But anyway, we do get a lot of focus now on people trying to figure out the trick for this game, with Sangmin instantly noticing that the white and yellow coins are bigger than the others, and he starts shaking them around and thinks they sound different, but doesn't really end up finding anything there. We then get this weird segment around how Kyunghoon finds out that they're magnetized, realizing that some of the coins stick to each other, with this being set up as, again, this being the big reveal, with him like instantly wanting to show everybody for some reason, only for Kyungran to tell him don't. But then he shows them anyway. So again, he thinks it only works on specific coins, only for it to turn out to work on all of them. So again, this all didn't matter anyway. But then we get a more real revelation with Dongmin needing to figure out a secret and showing his alliance that he's able to pick out 4 coins in a row without looking, with the reveal that he can tell the different weights of the coins, which is kind of insane, where the show does reveal in this moment here that yes, the red and white coins are made of different materials than the other 3, though they didn't think that would be noticeable, and the fact that Dongmin is able to notice that is kind of insane. But I do love that they actually revealed the real trick to all this, and that the reason for all this is because those 2 coins are magnetized and are able to be picked up with your name tag, which I'll say again feels a bit of a stretch. I feel like that's something that would be very difficult to actually put together. I don't know how many people would be thinking about using their name tag as part of the trick here, but again, really funny that Dongmin ended up finding a way to kind of game this that just ended up being completely unintentional. Anyway, the game ends up starting here with Jinho's alliance splitting up which coins they back, which obviously I get it in the sense that obviously you want those coins in the box, but also ends up being a pretty critical mistake here, especially separating Kyunghoon and Yohwan, who again are these 2 players that are on the bottom and need to gain garnets. So to give them like opposing incentives here ends up being essentially a death knell for the alliance, and essentially guarantees that one of those 2 will end up being the loser of this game. And again, if you are following astutely, that's something you should be able to notice like right away, but the show doesn't really end up focusing on that until pretty much the end of the episode, which is obviously more so for suspense. But anyway, we see Sangmin also here just following whatever Dongmin tells him to do, which is kind of funny considering Sangmin's comments about him in the premiere. So we do see their plan here being that their alliance is mostly going to back red and yellow, while Sangmin will back red and white, with the plan now being to give yellow first, white second, and red third, allowing the entire alliance to tie. considering Sangmin has a 1 Garnet advantage. To where, again, a really good strategy on paper. The problem is that they seem to forget the fact that the more you pick of a character, the less they'll end up being in the box and less opportunities to move them. And while obviously, again, there's the tie mechanic that can definitely help them out, it is something that they just seem to forget putting this strategy together. I think they're really both teams here not playing this particularly optimally. But anyway, round 1 starts with Johan being first and trying to listen into the box but can't, which puts him in a really funny pose. But anyway, you see Jinho and Junsok both picking all of the same color in a row, leading to Sangmin thinking that the other side must have found something, only to cut the Jinho saying it was a coincidence, which again is kind of funny. But also through all this, we do see Yunsun just playing on her own, just watching people talk, struggling to get allies, which again, another not great sign for a Season 2 player. But she ends up getting all blues and ends up trying to get blue to move, with this leading to a lot of people that she's backing blue, which might be relevant later. But after round 1, they do get to see all the coins in play, with Dongmin realizing how faulty his plan was, to where the characters they're supporting are barely even in the box, with almost no reds or yellows in play, and with so many blues and greens that they didn't back. So despite that, they're still able to get red to move 1 here, green moves 2, which really helps nobody, while white ends up moving 4, which is obviously good for Sangmin. So by the time of round 2, we do see Dongmin's alliance completely shift their plan here into just backing Sangmin and backing white, which is obviously good for Sangmin and whoever he gives immunity to, though realistically, again, I don't know why everyone else in this alliance gets on board with this, as again, obviously that just puts them in danger, especially again even if your side ends up winning, the opposing side's just going to pick someone from your side anyway. But in this spot, we do see Jinho's alliance now deciding to back blue, realizing that the other team doesn't have it, to where we do get this interesting moment here from Kyunghoon getting blues, and we get the reveal here that Sangmin planted him on the other side as a spy, only for Kyunghoon to not listen to him here and play for his team anyway. Though we do see Jinho's team thinking that they have Yunsun on board, thinking that she's backing blue as well, thinking they're in a good position, only for Dongmin's team to block blue anyway, with the reveal that Youngmin had planned that from the start, which I don't know why he needed to plan that, considering that seemed like the obvious move. Oh, we get the reveal here that also that Yunsun's not actually backing blue and just did that as a front when she's really backing white, and allows white to move 4 spaces again, meaning this game's essentially over by round 2. So I'll say, interesting play from Yunsun, definitely probably the way to play this as an individual, and again, also keeps her out of the 2 opposing sides, where again, I actually think she actually plays somewhat well by the end. But anyway, we get to round 3, where it's now that the show reveals the fault in Jinho's alliance, where we do see them completely floundering here, and despite Jinho's attempts to save Yohwan, which I will say in itself is a nice progression of their arc, Yohwan is essentially screwed here, especially with Kyunghoon deciding to end up playing for himself at the end here by blocking off yellow to ensure his safety, allowing for white to come in first, giving Sangmin the win, but then proceeding to give the token to Kyungran, while Yohwan loses as expected. Though again, also as expected, who would have guessed it? Pick someone from the opposing team. I never would have guessed that. And with him deciding to pick Yunsong, which I'll say is kind of random. I mean, Yunsong was barely even in this episode, so it really just comes out of the blue. But again, like once the tie plan fell through, again, someone from that group was always going to be picked. But anyway, we get to the deathmatch selection with Yohwan vetoing same picture and same number hunt to get rid of the memory tasks, which, and you would think as a poker player that's counting cards, you would think he would be good at that. But also he ends up getting rid of monorail as he never played it, which is like, you didn't prepare. Oh, Yunsun gets rid of all the betting game, with Yohwan being fake shocked at that. But ultimately, Tactical Yutenori ends up being selected here, which is a pretty even game in this spot. But obviously, we see them having to pick their helpers, with Yunsong picking Dongmin, which ends up being a really great pick for this, considering how good Dongmin's reads are. Oh, well, Yohwan picks Jinho, because Jinho's played this a lot, and also giving us, again, kind of a perfect end to Yohwan's story, in my point of view. Again, him and Jinho finally working together, only for it to obviously not work out for them. But anyway, we get to the death match, where we do get some fun from a lot of whispering between the 2 sides, them laughing at each other when they end up getting one up on the other. But Yohwan and Jinho end up being really demolished here by Dongmin and Yunsong, with Dongmin just really outplaying them every turn, seeming to be able to read what they're going to do, to where Yohwan can't even get a piece on the board. Oh, well, Yunsong just wins pretty easily here. Though it is funny that in Yohwan's loss here, we do get a lot more focus on Jinho and how sad he is for losing Yohwan, and how they question, can he bounce back from this? And again, just further adds to the fact that, again, it doesn't seem like production loved the Yohwan. Oh, well, again, kind of funny the like main character syndrome that Jinho ends up having here. But anyway, we lose Yohwan, and again, I really like Yohwan in Season 2. I think he's a character that, as time goes on, I further appreciate more and more. Yeah, obviously, again, Season 4 was not a good run for him. I mean, he really just seemed to be on the outs the entire time. just being outplayed at literally every turn, and really doesn't end up doing too much for the show itself either, to where, again, I think it's a very disappointing return from Yo Hwan, which again kind of makes him like a fairly inconsistent player. But to be fair, again, him losing at the end, again, losing alongside Jinho is at least, again, a kind of humorous way for him to go. But now moving on to episode 3, another one of the stronger episodes of the season, though also kind of a tragic one by the end. But it does start off with more Kyung-hoon following Sangmin, so that's something. But beyond that, we also get some weird content here rolling around. Yun-sun entering and talking about being an outcast, only for Kyung-ran to say, "You outcast yourself." To which we get this like weird editing of them fighting with like the Dark Vader theme music playing, and this again getting really propped up as this exciting fight, a battle scarier than a world war, and we see all the men cowering and reacting to every comeback like kids on the schoolyard. And again, all this was just very bizarrely put together, just felt very gendered and how this was portrayed. But also, to be honest, we also get like a weird segment around like joking about Hyungmin and Jungmoon dating, leading to Jinho making reference to Changyup, leading to Yun-sung telling Jinho that he should date Yun-sun, with this like weird romantic music playing, only for Jinho to get annoyed at Yun-sung, only for that to lead to Yun-sun being annoyed at Jinho for being annoyed over this. Where all this, again, very strange. But also here we do see Dongmin calling out Jinho for being in a rut. After, again, I guess just one bad episode, leading to Jinho calling him out. We talk about how this is just like Jinho calling out Gura, setting them up for going to the death match together, which will never happen. But anyway, we get to the third main match of the season, that being Today's Menu, a game where you're given 3 cards representing foods that I'm not even going to bother trying to announce, which, like, again, technically one of them is fried rice, and obviously that's easy, but outside that, again, not the easiest things to say. So again, I'm just going to call them red, yellow, and black. But you have to put them in your card box and guess how many of the others answer the same item to earn points, where if you are correct at being the only one, you get 5 points, 3 points for 2 to 3, 2 points for 4 to 6, 1 point for 7 to 10, all while 4 points for 11. Essentially a game that's built for you to goad everybody into going for 4 points, only for someone to be able to betray them at the last second. Again, overall, I think a fun game here, one that definitely is, again, very ripe for betrayal and can be played out in an interesting way. But it's in this moment where you do get flash forward to 2 hours later, showing people moving their boxes at the last second in slow-mo with somber music playing, or again, I wonder what's happening there. But we do get a pretty lengthy montage here of players just having conversations and agreeing to share info, all in the same room. Only for us to then cut to Kyung-ran running around and trying to find Sangmin, but can't. I wonder where that's going to lead to. Anyway, we have Dongmin and Hyungmin now trying to talk secretly. Where I'll say, like, Dongmin and Hyungmin have this very weird dynamic on this season, where obviously, again, they were this very tight alliance in the previous season, ran the show together, and obviously, again, I think a lot of players were obviously worried about that potentially happening again. But it felt like this time around, while they do work together at points, they weren't working in lockstep as much, especially towards the end of the game. Yeah, it is interesting to see these like little moments earlier on here of them again trying to play together again more secretly. But it is interesting to never actually see anyone actively go against Dongmin and Hyungmin across this season. And to fair, again, they're obviously massive threats that would be very difficult to take out of the game, especially in a game like the Genius, where again I think maybe there's this notion of better to work with them than against them. But it's kind of interesting to never see that perceived threat level coming into the season ever fall back on them. But here we do see them creating a plan to write notes like they did last season, and see them looking for a hiding spot, only for Dongmin to notice someone under the table, with the reveal that it was Sangmin, listening in with the reveal that he's been there for 30 minutes, which is insane, and listening in to everyone's conversations, which again just felt like this incredible Sangmin moment here. And one of the last Sangmin moments we get, which just really felt like this like great final like character moment here for Sangmin. And I just love Dongmin's reaction here, of him just being really aghast at the fact that Sangmin would be doing this. And I do love how like Sangmin just responds this by saying, "Did I tell you this was Sangmin's game or not?" But ultimately, also kind of funny in the sense that none of this ends up mattering, and they don't actually end up going through this plan anyway. Also through this, we do see players like Yun-sung and Kyung-ran and Sangmin and Dongmin create a plan here for everyone to work together for the first few rounds so that they can get garnets, only for that plan to just completely fall through right away. to where they end up just playing the first round here naturally. Though once we're down to a minute, we do see Sangmin having a lot of conversation, specifically one with Jinho, trying to give Jinho all the information for whatever reason, to which he ends up not noticing that time's running out, leading to a really funny reaction to him as there's only a few seconds on the clock, and he ends up running towards his box to try to move in time, only to ultimately fail at that, leading to him getting no points in the first round alongside Jungmoon, who just seemed to not have all the right information and put a different item than what she told people she was going to do for some reason, which obviously puts them both at the bottom, while everyone else gets 2 points outside of Jinho and Hyunmin, who end up taking the lead here, 3 points. But obviously this putting Sangmin in a pretty desperate position, though coming into round 2, we do see the players finally turning around on the idea of working together and agree to go for 4 points to get garnets. This is really coming down to Sangmin and Jungmoon, with them having to obviously agree to this, despite it obviously not helping them, to which they do, which I wonder if Sangmin has an ulterior motive here. Anyway, they end up all deciding to go for yellow and end up showing each other the boxes as they close them to make sure no one's lying here, only for at the last second for Kyunghoon to move his box all the way to 1. Oh, we see Sangmin smirking in the background, the real now that obviously Sangmin is now backing Kyunghoon to come in first and proceed to reveal to him the secret of the boxes, which really comes out of nowhere here in a spot where, again, it didn't seem like anyone noticed the fact that there is a black card on the bottom that can be used to cover what card you really are putting at the top, which, again, considering how many people we saw in the previous round trying to look for a gimmick here, it's kind of surprising you didn't see anybody but Sangmin looking for a gimmick in this spot. But it ends up leading to the moment, the flash forward of players scrambling to move their boxes at the last second, only for Hyunmin to be the only one to be able to move his box in time. Though we obviously see everyone being pissed here, Dongmin saying that he's picking Kyunghoon for the death match, only for Kyunghoon to reveal here that he did it because he wanted to save Sangmin, with everyone obviously now realizing that Sangmin was probably a part of it, where we obviously see Sangmin being upset that all you had to do is be quiet, would have come in first, where again Sangmin was planning on just leaking all the information to him, which would have allowed him to still get points. And really, obviously, this is a complete blunder here from Kyunghoon, where Sangmin's right. Again, all he had to do is shut up and he probably would have just easily won. Again, he obviously would have gotten 5 points here in a spot where at best Hyunmin got 1 point, would have put him in prime position to win the game, yet he ultimately ends up blurting too much here. And again, it won't be the last time here. But anyway, with that, we do see Sangmin and Kyunghoon now being isolated from the others, with Kyunghoon being kicked out of the room and saying he feels like a pervert, which, again, what a description. All while Sangmin ends up pulling over Kyungran right away, asking for her help, which does sow some distrust between her and Sangmin, and obviously really exposes their relationship even more. Might play a factor later in the episode, but ultimately, again, she doesn't end up helping him here anyway. And this is all while everyone now ends up working together to give Hyungmin the win, as he's already in the lead, but also to make Sangmin the loser, which, again, is a spot here where, like last episode, I don't know why everyone really gets on board with this. Obviously, again, it guarantees they're not the loser, but also they're still vulnerable to be picked by Sangmin. And again, I guess they have an idea of who Sangmin would potentially pick. And for those people, this isn't the worst call in the world, but it is kind of surprising that everyone literally gets on board with this, with no one ended up shifting away from this plan. Anyway, the majority ends up forming here to split their cards, give the best chance to Hyunmin and Jungmoon getting points. Though the reality is with this game, you can't really control everything, as obviously you can't control what Sangmin and Kyunghoon end up selecting, and again, if they end up guessing correctly, they'll get points anyway. So again, there's not really this like foolproof plan with this game to keep Sangmin on the bottom, especially if they get information where we do see Sangmin now making a deal with Dongmin, who does end up agreeing to save him in exchange for 3 garnets, and to make sure that Kyunghoon doesn't get any more points. With Sangmin actually going through this plan and giving Kyunghoon wrong information, with both of which actually going through this plan, again, Sangmin telling Kyunghoon wrong information for round 3, while Dongmin ends up being the one actually telling everybody what to do, where again, the fact that they put that much trust in the Dongmin's pretty insane. But again, things go according to plan, where by the end of round 3, we do see Sangmin and Jungmoon still tied at the bottom, while Hyunmin at that point is pretty much guaranteed to win, to where we do get to the final round, where we do see the majority, again, trying the same plan again, only for Junsuk to now be sus of what Sangmin and Dongmin are doing, where the plan now is for Sangmin to pick what Hyunmin ends up picking, being able to get 1 more point than Jungmoon, and end up putting Jungmoon in last, which again seemed to be going through until we get the reveal that Junsuk changed his card at the last second to counter Sangmin, because Kyunghoon, once again, decided to tell him what they were doing for some reason, which also, they probably didn't even need to involve Kyunghoon in all this either, so that was probably just a fundamental issue of even telling Kyunghoon about this, which, I mean, I'll say again, like, Sangmin really didn't even need to involve Kyunghoon in this either, so that's probably a flaw there, especially considering how loose-lipped you just saw him be. But again, the fact that Kyunghoon ruins it again for Sangmin in this spot is just kind of humorous, though again, very savvy play here from Junsuk, even though, again, it obviously just comes off makes him come off even more as a snake. Again, it is kind of funny how it's Jungmoon really being saved here, just completely out of her control. She had no idea what was going on and gets saved by Junsuk changing his card at the last second. But anyway, this leads to Sangmin being the deathmatch candidate. While Hyungmin ends up winning here as expected, giving his token to Dongmin, which again, probably not the greatest perception-wise, though says that he's picking Dongmin because he knows that Sangmin wouldn't pick him anyway. But ultimately, we do see Sangmin deciding to pick Kyunghoon here, and I think that is such a questionable decision. Now, obviously, again, I get it, as obviously Kyunghoon just blew up his spot twice just in this main match, and I do think there's like an aspect of Sangmin that probably underestimated Kyunghoon's deathmatch ability, which, to be fair, he has not been able to demonstrate up to this point. Obviously, he lost the one deathmatch he played in beforehand, but I do think this is a spot here where, considering how much Kyunghoon talks about how much he's prepared for some of these deathmatches, like, would you really want to face off against him in a deathmatch? And also, getting rid of him's not the optimal play here for Sangmin. Again, Kyunghoon's still like a potential ally. Obviously, again, you would have to probably micromanage what you tell him a bit more, but I do think him actively getting rid of Kyunghoon here probably was not the correct call. I think he would have probably been better off like picking someone like a Jungmoon in this spot, but either way. For a deathmatch selection here, we do see them now being only able to veto 2 games, with Sangmin vetoing Gyeol Hap, which he, again, seemed to be pretty bad at, and Monorail, as Kyunghoon knows a solution for Monorail, which I'm sure that will never come up again. Kyunghoon gets rid of the poker game, saying that Sangmin is good at reading people's thoughts and betting, which is like, is he? Like, I mean, he literally lost Indian Hold'em to Yohwan in season 2, and beyond that, again, like, he's just never been that good. And to be fair, again, like, Sangmin probably isn't going to be that good at many of these death matches remaining. So I think I would have taken out Quattro at least in this spot over both of the poker games. But again, if I was him, I think I would have gotten rid of Quattro and betting rock, paper, scissors if I was him. And what do you know? The game selected ends up being betting rock, paper, scissors, which ends up being in the perfect death match selected here once again. Again, being obviously the one that Kyunghoon lost the last time around, considering the social aspect of it, but also it now being the battle between the dog and the owner, which again, funny that actually ends up playing out here. But betting rock, paper, scissors here has similar rules the last time, though now with the ability to bet on draws to obviously counter that mechanic from the previous season that Yunsuk really manipulated, and actually making it more powerful to bet on draws as you get triple that you betted, which does allow for bigger swings, especially in spots where people lie about what cards they use, which again, we'll see attempted to play out. But anyway, we do see Sangmin and Kyunghoon seem to get most of the information and even share their information, which again will surely all be correct information. But it is funny that we do see Dongmin advising Sangmin before the match, only for Sangmin to just not listen to any of it, but it somehow work out for him initially anyway. But the big swing in this game here ends up coming from Kyunghoon picking a card, only for him to say that he made the wrong choice, and Sangmin saying it can't be helped, which again should be obvious this is a ploy, where again it really feels like Sangmin just really underestimated Kyunghoon in this spot. Where again he should have been able to see through this, yet he doesn't, leading to Sangmin going all in on draw, only for the reveal that Kyunghoon won, leading up to Sangmin being down 13-0 in this spot, which felt pretty hopeless, to which we do end up flashing back and having this big montage, their relationship, clearly being met as this like farewell montage to Sangmin, only for us to get to the final round with it now being 18-6, and it coming down to Kyungran, where all Kyunghoon needs to do here is essentially not draw, and he ends up automatically winning. Though this is where we get the reveal that Kyungran lied to Kyunghoon to save Sangmin, giving Sangmin a shot here, where if Kyunghoon accidentally draws and Sangmin goes all in on draw, he can get it back to a tie, only for it to be revealed that Kyunghoon didn't believe a second of it, as obviously he knew that Kyungran was going to try to save Sangmin, and specifically use the card that Kyungran told him she picked because he knew it wouldn't lead to a tie, leading to obviously Sangmin ultimately losing here, which is obviously all, again, pretty good play from Kyunghoon, where I do think he makes some pretty savvy plays throughout this deathmatch, though I think he probably has been thinking about this deathmatch for a while leading up to this, considering this is the one he lost last time. But anyway, we do get a pretty sorrow farewell here for Sangmin, again, talking about how the genius gave him a new start to life, with, again, that seeming to be accurate, or from what I understand, Sangmin's career really ended up exploding after this, where I know he's like started a hosting career, which again, good for him, considering it seemed like his career was kind of in the dumps when he started this. But either way, again, let's talk about Sangmin. And again, obviously one of the greatest showmans in all of reality television. I think he really ends up having some of the best moments in the history of reality television over the course of his genius career. And this obviously being the end of it, again, so early on in the season is such a shame, but also I think is so fitting. I think where, again, he really is the main character of these first 3 episodes, with him getting obviously the big moment in the ID exchange game, him obviously having big moments in this episode. It really felt like he was like hogging up so much of the screen time. So again, I think it's so fitting for him to have this, again, big splash on the season, but not really being the main focus of the season. In a spot where he already had, again, season 2 pretty much being almost solely dedicated to him, and obviously having a very good run in season 1 as well. So obviously it's a shame to lose Sangman so early. I do actually like the fact that this doesn't end up being another completely dominated season by Sangman, even though, again, he obviously gets his fair share of great moments across it. Now for episode 4, which for it being immediately after the elimination of Sangman, and obviously there being some worries if the season would really keep its momentum without him, I do feel like this episode in itself ends up quelling those worries for a little bit at least, being probably one of my favorite episodes of the entire season. Though it does start off with a lot of focus around Kyung-hoon as expected, with him being the last to enter, with him having dyed his hair, with them referring back to Sangman having done so in season 2, with him also coming in wearing sunglasses, and him clearly trying to look very cool in his entrance here, only for everyone to hide behind the stairs as he enters. But we do get to talk about Kyung-hoon's now a stray dog looking for a new owner, to which we do see him humorously asking Dongmin, being asked to be his owner, and him being scared leading into the intro. But beyond that, we do also get talk from Jinho about how the top 3 from season 2 are gone, and only 2 season 2 players are left in Yoonsun and Jinho, with Jinho now claiming that he's from season 1 instead. And again, surely this is just a trend that won't continue, but also probably just further proof that season 2 probably has the weakest cast from a competitive standpoint. But either way, we do get to the 4th main match, that being Fish Shop, a game that is clearly based around Fruit Stand from season 3, where it's another game where you sell items in dollar increments between 1 through 5, where the lowest offer ends up winning. But a modification here is that instead of just being tied to 2 items like in Fruit Stand, here you overall have 6 sale tickets you can use over the course of 4 rounds, being able to be used to sell any fish. Being an interesting modification to this challenge, adding a lot more versatility. The problem is that really it's also kind of broken, as it actually leads to a pretty obvious optimal strat that we end up seeing being exploited by numerous people on this cast. But again, we obviously get more focus on Kyung-hoon here, talking about how this is Kyung-hoon's game. Despite that, we still continue to see him being left out of game talks, and this does lead to Kyung-hoon just openly telling people that he's picking squid for $1, being to open talk about having to avoid selling the same fish as him, which is in what we later learn is actually not that bad of a strategy. But here we do also see Jinho and Dongmin seemingly coming up with the optimal strat right off the bat of just saying, why don't we just offer $1 for all 3 fish? Which is kind of funny considering that's literally what you should do, only for them to just not do that. But again, they do talk about forming a big alliance here, which ends up containing the typical suspects you would expect Dongmin and Jinho to be aligned with, which again will surely work out for him. Always get a lot of focus here around Hyungmin, who decides to sell each of the fish and pretends like he's going to be selling all of them for $5, only for that plan to be immediately squashed by Junsok, who openly says he won't be going for $5, where he seems to have a similar strat to Kyung-hoon, which again I wonder why. But Hyungmin does talk about how his strategy is to win the game in round 1 by undercutting the others. So while he is forced to go $1 on hairtails because of Junsok, he proceeds to go $4 on mackerels, in a spot where everyone that's selling that agreed to do 5. While we see him do some negotiating around the squids, with him telling Jinho they should bid 4 to undercut those that are doing 5, when in reality he's actually intending on bidding 3, making a deal with Kyung-hoon to bid 3 in this spot instead of 1, which I question also, like, why didn't Jinho just do 1 if he thought there was a chance of Kyung-hoon doing 1? But either way, again, in Hyungmin's mind, him and Kyung-hoon are doing this together and bidding 3 and undercutting the others on squid, to which Hyunmin ends up proceeding to use his secret on this item, where again, like Fruit Stand, you get to keep 1 result a secret per game, and again, Hyunmin uses it here, even though it's funny that he does so, is actually leads him being clueless for the rest of the game, a spot where actually if he did know the result of this, he probably would have known he was in dire straits, but he would have probably known that his situation was pretty dire. But anyway, finally, so we do proceed to see Hyunmin just openly tell people that he used the secret in this spot, which really makes you question, like, why? Like, doesn't that ruin the point of you using your secret? But again, it is a spot where Hyunmin just assumed that he got one over on Jinho and Yeonsong, which, I mean, to be fair, he did on Jinho, but, and again, thinks he's in cahoots with Kyung-hoon when in reality, again, he's set up to lose in this position, where we do get so much overconfident Hyunmin content in this episode, with this being a particularly bad look for him. But again, we do see him saying that he thinks he's in first, with the reveal that him and Dongmin are actually working in a secret alliance here, with the plan being for Hyunmin to get as much money as he can in the first couple rounds, only for Dongmin to then use all of his tickets to block everyone out in the final 2 rounds, which again is a sound strategy on paper if it wasn't for the fact that literally everyone else would be taking this to an even further extreme, where really, again, a lot of their strategy really banks on the overconfidence that no one else will be bidding $1 at every opportunity, which again will surely never happen. But again, we do get most of this game from their perspective, with this entire episode being one of those major examples of the strengths of the Genius's editing style, where again, had this been edited in a more linear way in the way that most other reality shows are portrayed, this would have been a pretty dull episode, with the result being very obvious from the end of the first round. Yet despite that, we actually end up being set up for so many twists and turns over the course of this episode for a much more dynamic result, with a lot of twists and turns across this episode that really makes this episode stand out as one of the best the show has to offer. But here we do see Jinho proceeding to call over his alliance, to which he ends up being confused over the calculations, which again, not a great look for Jinho here. Definitely playing into the fact that he's in a rut, I guess. But once again, he brings up the optimal strat that they should just offer one to not waste their opportunities, only for Kyungran to say, why do that when they can go for 3 and cooperate? Because surely everyone's going to do that. But this is all for Dongmin, just to tell him to go for 1 instead, seemingly trying to protect them in this spot, where obviously, again, he's in reality screwing them over, with Jinho seemingly being screwed in this position due to the first round, with him not getting anything there. And then everyone from this point on proceeding to bid 1, which essentially gives him no opportunity to really make up money. It really is a spot here where Dongmin's, again, trying to save him, even though, again, him and Hyungmin had already kind of screwed him over, at least in their minds. But either way, we do have Hyungmin here admitting to Jinho that they betrayed him, leading to them really spending the rest of this main match here, again, obviously having already assumed that Hyunmin has won, and instead try to find a way to save Jinho. That Youngsung is in a similar position to him, not getting anything in that first round as well, and proceed to put together this plan to save Jinho by having Dongmin bid 2 on 1 to fish to allow Jinho to get a very slight lead over Youngsung to avoid last, with that plan seeming to go according to plan. Though we do also get this weird subplot in the middle of all this of the reveal that Hyungmin had already admitted to Youngsung that he betrayed him as well, which why is he telling everybody that he betrayed them? And had previously told him to bid 1 in a previous round, which is what's making this result relatively close, because again, surely Youngsung would only bid 1 at the one time that Hyungmin told him to do so. But either way, we do get to the results, which are some pretty big results, where we do get the reveal that Hyungmin's not in first, Youngsung is in first, which in itself, again, a pretty insane result. Obviously, we were under the assumption, based on how the game played out up to this point, that Youngsung was at the bottom, that he was supposed to go into the death match, only for him to end up being the winner here. But what's even more insane beyond that is the fact that the actual loser of this main match is Hyunmin, which is, again, a really mind-blowing reveal here. Again, really one of these, again, masterstroke genius moments here of this realization that everything we've seen up to this point was simply just not true. We get some really great over-the-top editing in this moment of seeing most players shocked and see this slow-mo of this despair on Hyunmin's face as he realizes that he's lost. I'll always see Youngsung and Junsuk celebrating in the background, all this being interlaced with cocky Hyungmin confessionals, with, again, this probably being one of my favorite reveals of all time, where we do proceed to flashback to the very beginning of the game for a pretty lengthy flashback here explaining what exactly happened during this game, revealing that there were 2 alliances that the show remained hidden until now, where while we obviously focused a lot on the Dongmin Hyungmin pairing, the reality is that there were 2 other pairings essentially doing the same thing, but just better, where we first get introduced here to Kyunghoon and Yoo-hyun, who end up working together from the very beginning, with their plan being to use their 12 tickets together to block out every single fish for every round by just bidding 1. Which, again, is the optimal play and is such an obvious optimal play to make, which is, again, just what most players should have been able to recognize is what they should be doing here. As obviously in doing so, you make sure that no one else can get money, and even if they do, they'll get the same amount as you. Or if you are the only person to be utilizing this strategy, you're nearly guaranteed to win, or at least guaranteed to not lose playing this way. The issue is that, again, there's another alliance literally doing the exact same thing, where you get the reveal that Youngsung and Junsuk also were in an alliance that was utilizing this exact same strategy, with both alliances also having this added aspect of it of having one player act as a distraction, with Kyunghoon and Junsuk's declarations that they're going to be selling for 1 from earlier being revealed as part of this plan, both as a way to distract from what's really going on, but also as a way to lure players away from the fish that they're picking, aka giving more of an opportunity for Yuhyun and Youngsung to make money. As again, no matter what, they're going to be using ones, and through that, if anyone else uses anything but one, they make more money that way. And ultimately, again, just the optimal way to be playing this game, to where, again, we see Hyungmin just be very overconfident, despite his strategy just being, again, a lesser version of this, where he thought he can get away with bidding 3s and 4s, when the reality is that he should be bidding 1 the entire time. And again, was so cocky in the fact that he thought he had won, that he spent most of the main match trying to save Jinho in a spot where he needed to be trying to save himself. So ultimately, this main match ended up being decided all the way back in round 1, where essentially it was based around what fish Yeonsung and Yuhyun ended up picking during that round, and who else was bidding on those items, where here we do see Yeonsung pulling out the win due to the fact that both Hyungmin and Jinho ended up not bidding 1 on Squid, while Yeonsung didn't pick Squid and instead picked Hairtail in a spot where obviously Hairtail sold for 1 due to Junsuk's strategy, which again, a slight difference there that gives Yeonsung the win here, and ultimately culminating probably again one of the best reveals that the show has to offer. But ultimately again, Yeonsung ends up giving the token to Junsuk as expected, which does actually seem to increase the target on Youngsung's back. We talk about how scary he is now, and ultimately, again, it doesn't really lead to that much, but it does feel like a bit of a different Youngsung from what we've seen in the past, who has typically been a more honor-bound player, one that's been kind of aloof, being outplayed during a lot of these main matches, where, again, I thought was a nice follow-up on Season 3 to see him outplay Dongmin and Hyungmin in this spot. But it is funny that throughout all this, we see Hyungmin still being shell-shocked as he proceeds to have to pick his opponent here, with him ultimately picking Yeonsung, who was barely even in this episode, and we also get very little explanation for why he picks her outside the fact that she was just someone he wasn't working with, which ultimately probably the correct choice here, considering she was probably one of the least connected players on the board, and also just someone that he's pretty likely to beat in most death matches. But anyway, we get to the deathmatch selection with them being able to exclude 2 games each, with Hyungmin taking out the poker games here, talking about how luck dependent they are. We see Yeonsung taking out 12 Jongi and Monorail, which also pretty fair, considering Hyungmin's expertise, and also the fact that she herself had lost at Laser Chess, which is, again, similar to Jongi at least. But ultimately, the game selected here ends up being Same Number Hunt. Again, another solid pick here. This allowing for there to be redemption from Hyungmin, who obviously lost this to Dongmin in Season 3. And it mostly follows the same rules as last time, though a weird addition here is the fact that instead of the minus sign on the board, they end up instead putting a square root of X plus square root of Y tile on the board, because people will surely use that. And also through this, again, like Season 3, they play Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag music while introducing all of this, which is very strange. But anyway, deathmatch itself ends up being solid enough. One that I think you would expect Hyungmin to really dominate this. But we do see Yeonsung putting up a pretty good fight and actually being in the lead at a point, though ultimately Hyungmin ends up still pulling out the win here, beating Yeonsung 9-6, and continuing this trend of Season 2 players going out of the game all in a row. And with that, we obviously lose Yeonsung, who again ends up being another Season 2 player that just felt like a little bit out of her depth on this season. It felt like a spot where coming into this, I feel like you would think of her as a player that definitely had a lot of potential on Season 2. And on Season 4, she again was just kind of isolated from most of the social dynamics. Didn't really feel like she was involved in many alliances, sometimes actively played on her own, but still felt like a spot here where, kind of like Yohwan, she never really found her footing in the game. And mixing that with the fact that she was never really the most consistent player outside that, again, it didn't really seem like a season poised for success for Yeonsun, even though, again, it does feel like this is a spot here where she probably performed better than I expected in a deathmatch. And it does also feel like she's kind of sniped out in this spot where there wasn't really much setup for going into the deathmatch. It didn't really seem like she did like that much actively wrong during this round, but again, just felt like she didn't have the connections to really keep her safe, which leads to her going out a little bit anticlimactically in this spot. Now for episode 5, which I will say is quite possibly my least favorite Genius episode in the show's history. I feel like it's an episode that really does not give me much to really chew on. I feel like there were a lot of questionable decisions made with this episode that just made this episode as a whole just a very frustrating watch. But anyway, it does start off with Jinho getting to talk about being the last surviving Season 2 player, because again, that had to be mentioned again. Only to lead the Kyunghoon, declaring himself as the King Slayer for taking out Sangmin, and now setting his eyes for Jinho, which will surely happen soon. Either way, we get get to the 5th main match, that being Loyalists and Rebels. Again, one of my least favorite main matches in the show's history, where this ends up being a social deduction game with 6 Loyalists and 3 Rebels. And again, these type of games typically don't work well in the Genius, but in this game, players have to go to the dealer room one by one and are presented with numbers that they have to use to add a number to either the A or B column, where you can only add numbers higher than previous number, and the game ends if you go over 1,000, where obviously the Rebels are trying to get that number over 1,000, while obviously the Loyalists are trying to keep it under. Now, at the end of each round, the players will vote for a king that sends 2 other players into jail, who are then proceeded to be excluded from the next round. A mechanic that obviously disfavors Rebels, is obviously they're in jail, then there's not much they can really do in that spot. Obviously, again, the best case scenario would be a Rebel being voted as the king, and really just be able to play all the Loyalists, though ultimately, again, we never see that really happening in the Genius. To favor the Loyalists even more, as the Genius likes to do, they also add in a failsafe for the Loyalists, in that even if the Rebels end up being able to go over 1,000, we'll still get a final round where they elect a new king, and if both people in jail afterwards are Rebels, then the Loyalists win anyway, with also those 2 in jail instantly going to the death match, obviously making it so there's no stakes for anyone else. Now, at least they do give the final king a token no matter what, which obviously gives at least some incentive there for them to potentially strike a deal with the Rebels, but it's also where in that position you're betraying half the players in the game for almost no reason. Or ultimately, again, I think this is a terrible game. I think it's a game that really just screws over the Rebels. I think you're all but automatically going to lose if you're a Rebel, where again, it's very difficult to get the number to over 1,000 without the Rebels just outing themselves. And again, with these other mechanics in play that have it that if 2 Rebels are out there, you can just lock them away and they just instantly lose. It just makes this a game that feels like when it's largely just determined by the random draw, where if you draw being a Rebel, you're pretty much screwed unless you instantly ran out your team. Also, just kind of handing immunity to the Loyalists just because they're in a very fortunate position to begin with. But again, we do see everyone clearly recognizing right away that obviously the optimal position to be in is a Loyalist, and we do see Jungmoon being worried right away because of her experience with the zombie game, which I'll mention to that fact. Again, in reaction to the zombie game, they do actually have a display here showing each player what the Loyalist and Rebel cards look like, so they don't get caught in the way that Jungmoon did during the zombie game, which again is a cool little lesson learned there from production. But as the roles are being picked here, the only person that we do get confirmed right off the bat ends up being Dongmin as a Loyalist, in a position where I do question why they did this, where again, I think for me, this is a terrible episode from really almost every facet. I think it's a terrible episode from the game itself and how it plays out, but I also feel like it's a very lackluster episode from a editing perspective, where they later end up putting in so much tension behind, is Kyungran a Rebel or not, where I actually think it would have been a lot more interesting had they actually done a different approach, instead having you question if Dongmin was a Rebel or not, as again, Dongmin is someone that instantly takes control of this game, really leads the Loyalists through every portion of the game, and I think having that doubt in your mind of could Dongmin be this Rebel that's tricking all the other Loyalists, I think that was probably the more suspenseful way of handling this game, though they kind of throw that away from the very beginning, and instead we kind of just know that Dongmin's right about everything throughout this entire process. But here we do see some focus around Kyunghoon, who ends up getting some very hammy content with him just playing detective and giving a Rebel report, with him instantly being sus of Jungmoon and proceeding to put his hands on her face, which is bizarre and again definitely feels inappropriate, but he ends up saying that her cheeks are flushed and that she's a Rebel, which again, he's right, but also again, like weird way of handling all this. And as always, see Young Song call out Jinho as a Rebel, with Kyunghoon proceeding to try to do the same thing to Jinho, only for him to run away, with Kyunghoon thinking he's a Rebel because he didn't allow him to touch his cheeks, which is a weird thing to say. But again, right away we see Junsok just instantly clocking the optimal strat here for the Loyalists, in that he ends up proposing a deal that if one of the Rebels rats out the other 2, that they will just instantly throw the other 2 into elimination, which, and the fact that they got this right away just shows how broken this game ends up being. But something I did find funny about this is that Jinho then proceeds to mention the worry that obviously the Rebels can proceed to lie to them. There's a position where Kyunghoon's impressed by that idea, to where he now thinks that Jinho isn't a Rebel because he helped the Loyalists, despite the fact that he later is sus of Junsok, who came up with this idea to begin with. Now, again, I get the fact that in his mind, he thinks that Junsok maybe proposed this as a Rebel to trick the Loyalists, but again, it really just feels like Kyunghoon just having the, like, kind of typical, like, just a billion reads, and obviously some of them have to be right, where we do see him proceeding to outline his entire thought process here, with him, again, just being wrong on everybody but Jungmoon, where he proceeds to say that he thinks that Kyungran has to be a Loyalist because she doesn't understand the rules, and you would have to as a rebel, because clearly she couldn't pretend to just not know the rules, and too far I would not put it past Kyungran to actually generally not understand the rules and still be a rebel. But either way, he proceeds to think that obviously Jungmoon is a rebel alongside Youngsung, because Youngsung was reading the rules a lot, because I guess that's a sign that you're a rebel. Oh, well, he also thinks Junsuk could be one as well, because it's Junsuk. Well, we do see the game starting here with Kyunghoon being the first to enter, with him being able to add a 1 to the board, in a spot where he reveals the numbers he was given were 1, 4, 1, 5, in a position where Dongmin instantly realizes that the numbers are pi, with it coming to his mind with Junsuk joking about this beforehand, and this later gets confirmed in the following round, to where it's at this point where Jungmoon reveals that she knows the first 100 digits of pi, because she thought it would be fun to memorize them for some reason. To which she then goes off on her own, is able to write out the first 70 numbers, which makes you really question, like, why is she doing this when she's a rebel? Now, I know her strat, as she talks about later, is that she was hoping that this would allow her to become the final king, and she could sabotage from there, but ultimately, again, this felt like a very questionable decision here, especially when you have someone like Dongmin, who's obviously very dominating in these positions, and will clearly just be nominated as the king by the end anyway. And again, we do see her constant references to her wanting to be the last king be something that Dongmin ends up picking up on, and ends up realizing she's sus because of it. Though again, this also brings the question, why they decide to use pi as the number here, where again, obviously, again, I don't know if you can expect people to actually memorize the first 70 numbers of pi, but it's still a position where why even make it something that breakable? Why? Again, it just feels like another disadvantage added on to the rebels in a spot where I feel like just inherently they need all the help that they can get. But beyond this, we do then get some tension here from a confrontation between Yoo-hyun and Kyunghoon, where we see Yoo-hyun writing notes, then proceeding to turn the page as Kyunghoon walks over to him, with Kyunghoon trying to grab his notes. Where again, Kyunghoon's being very touchy in this episode, which is very strange. But again, this leads to Yoo-hyun trying to get away from him, and Kyunghoon following him, with them starting to bicker over Kyunghoon just wanting to see his notes, and him not showing them, which obviously just leads to everyone thinking he's a rebel. Again, I think that's another tough aspect of this game, not just in the fact that the inherent game mechanics are very weighted against the rebels, but also in mixing in the fact that, again, there's just social cues and other actions outside of just the actual picking of the numbers to base things around as well. It just makes this, again, even more of an impossible task for the rebels. Anyway, we do see them selecting the king, to which everyone just agrees on Dongmin, obviously, with Dongmin obviously hamming this up for the show and acting like he's a real king. But this leads to Junsuk telling him to pick Jinho and Kyungran into jail, which isn't really explained, though clearly there was some sus on Kyungran already, with Kyungran proceeding to follow Dongmin as he proceeds to make his choice, asking if he really suspects her, which obviously comes off even more sus, with him proceeding to tell her that if you're a rebel, tell Jinho, which felt like him trying to give a lifeline here to Kyungran in a spot where he clearly already thinks that she is a rebel, with him later explaining it's because she's behaving differently and isn't adding to the conversations. Though, again, it's kind of funny that we do see Jinho coming out of his time with Kyungran in jail, not thinking she's a rebel, despite, again, it should be kind of obvious, but anyway, we do get the round 2, where, again, it seems pretty dire for the rebels, where we do see Yoo-hyun struggling in the dealer room, saying we'll never win at this rate, and proceeds to put in 99. An unnecessary massive jump up to where, obviously, it's at this point where we get the reveal that he's a rebel. And again, he's essentially just playing as outed rebel at this point. Though, again, I did love him joking around about how he only had 9999 as his numbers. But I would say at this point, I do question Yoo-hyun's overall strategy here, as at the point that you know that you've lost, why not just take the deal and rat out the other rebels, where again, this game is such a dire one where you're almost never going to actually win. I feel like at the first moment that I think I'm going to lose, I feel like I would just instantly rat out the others. And while obviously, again, it's a seemingly immoral way of playing this game in a kind of cowardly way, it is a way that obviously your safety for this round, in a spot where essentially if you're a rebel, you essentially have a 2/3 chance of just going straight into the death match, which is, again, kind of lame. But it's at this point where you see Dongmin saying that he's going to give one last chance to the rebels to reveal themselves. Oh, we have Kyunghoon in the background here, just like still incorrectly accusing people of being a rebel, only for Dongmin to unpromptedly just say, how about that, Jungmoon? With this obviously being this big reveal that he's known that it's been Jungmoon this entire time. With Jungmoon proceeding to say, well, is it a guarantee? Obviously being the reveal now that she's a rebel as well, which again, everyone already knew. So she ends up ratting out the others, and again, ends up playing in this very self-preservation based way, which is what you would expect from Jungmoon. And with that, essentially the game's over, where we do get to round 3, where we see them ending the game right away, and we do get this worry of, is Jungmoon lying to them? And we do see Dongmin being named the final king, during which he's annoyed that he can't vote for himself, because, again, he's hamming it up. But again, it leads to a lot of setup here of what is Dongmin going to do? Or is he going to go with the guarantee of doing Yuhyun and Jungmoon and betray Jungmoon, or is he going to believe her and put in Kyungran? Which again ends up being propped up as this big question, when in reality it doesn't really matter for Dongmin, as either way he's safe, considering he has the token either way. And again, as I said, I think this would have been a lot more suspenseful if there was a little bit more doubt here on whether or not Dongmin had been truthful throughout all this. But ultimately, again, it was kind of obvious what he was going to do, though, as again, he doesn't really have any real incentive here to go against his word, so he ultimately does go with Kyungran. Sure, we do get a pretty predictable result, though we do actually see Kyungran putting up a fight here, again, continuing to beg Dongmin as he makes his choice, and though ultimately, again, it's to no avail, and we do ultimately get the reveal that she is a rebel, leading to Kyungran and Yuhyun automatically going to the deathmatch, with Kyungran clearly being annoyed at Jungmoon here for ratting them out, which again is the downsides of doing that. Yeah, along with the fact that, again, they could just betray you and put you in anyway, but again, I do think that is still the play in this game, considering just how unlikely it is for the rebels to win this game. But either way, we do get to the deathmatch selection, where they each get to exclude 2 games, with Yuhyun picking Gyeohap and Same Picture Hunt being 2 matches that Kyungran has experience in, while Kyungran takes out 12 Jonggi and Monorail, leaving the poker games and Quattro. Which again, I'm kind of surprised not more people were eliminating Quattro, considering how luck-based that game is. And really, to be fair, all 3 of these games are very luck-based, considering the poker games are also pretty luck-based in these more condensed versions here. But with Yuhyun being a poker player, he will obviously have an advantage here, and what do you know, ends up being Indian poker, which again, another pretty solid deathmatch pick here. Again, a spot where, again, Yuhyun is a poker player, but also beyond that, Kyungran lost this match against Jinho in her first season, so again, this offers the opportunity for redemption for her. Though I did find the deathmatch itself to be just kind of bland. Again, I've said this in the past, I never loved the poker games as television products. I don't feel like they lead to that great of TV most of the time, and I do feel like most of this just felt kind of mundane, though they do get some nice moments here from like a reference to season 1 with Kyungran saying look at me, and Yuhyun saying I've seen this before. Oh, you do see Kyungran performing pretty well here, taking a lot of Dongmin's advice, which works out well for her, only for us to see Yuhyun getting fairly unlucky with getting a lot of lower cards, culminating in him going all in when he sees Kyungran having a 1, only for her to call because it turns out that they both have a 1, leading to a tie, with him ultimately losing in a 4-3, which is, again, very unlucky in that position, with Yuhyun getting kind of sniped out of the game here in what would, again, inherently feel embarrassing of a poker player being eliminated in a poker game. But anyway, we lose Yuhyun, who ultimately, again, like, did not get to do that much on this season, where that is kind of a strange thing about Grand Final, and that, like, pretty much all the boots that we've talked about so far, outside Sangmin, end up getting kind of minimal screen time, where it does feel like the season largely revolves around a lot of the people that make it much deeper into the game. And because I do feel like Yuhyun just didn't have much to do on this season, while it didn't seem like he was necessarily playing poorly, and again, it seemed like there were actually some points where he was playing decently well, like in Fish Shop, he simply did not get much of the focus on the show. It felt like, again, a lot of the focus went to the likes of Sangmin, to the likes of Dongmin and Hyungmin and Jinho and Kyunghoon, where not really much was left for Yuhyun, with, again, him clearly just not getting as large of an edit as he got in season 3. Though, again, I don't think he necessarily played this round entirely poorly. He just, again, was given a really raw hand here, again, being drawn as a rebel to begin with, and then getting some pretty unlucky results during the poker game, to where I do feel like he's still a player that demonstrated a lot of skill over the course of his genius career. Yeah, again, this was just a very unfortunate set of circumstances that caused him to go out in this spot. Now, for episode 6, another pretty decent episode. Again, kind of a rebound after the previous one, but we do start off with more weird, like, forcing of pitting the women together, where them calling out Jungmoon for wearing black and Kyungran for wearing white. And again, while there is obviously some tension from the previous round between them, again, all this felt, again, very forced. But anyway, we get to the 6th main match, which is revealed to be a Garnet match. This probably being the strongest one of the bunch from my point of view. Again, it being in the middle of the game here. In a spot where there was more time here for you to gather Garnets. Also, this ends up being a main match that just allows for more circulation of Garnets, to where the main match itself ends up being Garnet Thief. Again, an interesting game here where there are 4 Garnets distributed each round, where each player selects one of 4 groups during each turn. Those groups being the Mafia, Cartel, Police, and Beggar, with Mafia and Cartel acting similarly and taking priority, where whichever of the 2 has the most selecting them gets Garnets evenly distributed between those that pick it, while if no one picks it, or I guess theoretically more than 4, those garnets go to the police. However, in whatever situation there is, if there's leftover garnets, they instead go to the beggars. To me, a pretty interesting modification of like an abundance and famine style game, though actually made good. With also an additional touch here added in that I did like, in the fact that we obviously have a turn order that rotates. Though whenever you pick your group for the turn, you have to publicly announce it. Though what you select can be different from what you publicly announce. Though if you lie and you do not get a point, you lose a garnet. Adding this, again, interesting risk-reward aspect to this game here. Again, feeling like somewhat in line with like something like Doubting Utanori or something, where I kind of like this kind of like mixture of these two previous styles of main matches into creating a, again, pretty decent one here. Like really expanding upon a pretty basic formula. Though beyond that, we do see in the other garnet matches that there is a rule that you're not allowed to give away garnets during the match. However, for this one, they for some reason changed that, and I really don't know why they did this. I guess it was just to further incentivize like making deals. Just makes it more likely that people can plan out like a joint win, which I don't know if they really want that or not. Again, I really don't know why they did this, but again, we do see players being allowed to receive one garnet from another player after rounds 3 and 7, which leads to some drama, but ultimately drama that doesn't really matter that much. But instantly we do see alliances split here in two, essentially being this David versus Goliath dynamic here of, again, this like overdog alliance of Jinhyo, Kyungran, Dongmin, and Hyungmin facing off against Jungmoon, Junsok, Yunsong, and Kyunghoon. Essentially like the finalists versus non-finalists by this point. And again, outside of Yunsong, all those non-finalists being very early boots. But anyway, we see Dongmin obviously leading his alliance as you would expect, saying that they can make someone the sole loser in round 7, with him making a plan to obviously make someone in his alliance a sole winner, but also to make himself the sole loser to take out the other side. Again, the typical martyr approach that he does very often for no reason, doesn't lead to anything because he never actually goes through with it. But he talks about how his goal today is to get rid of Junsok, which will surely happen, all while Junsok openly declares his target's Kyungran, which also, why is he doing that? But very quickly we do see Dongmin revealing to us that they have a spy for their side, with that obviously being Jungmoon, because I mean, come on, obviously it's Jungmoon. Or as you see her making signals to tell their side what they picked. Though in this moment, we then flash forward to 4 hours later, with Jungmoon freaking out, saying that they're so mean and these people are so cruel, which obviously shows you the direction that's going. But again, Jungmin turns out to be a pretty terrible spy here, like not even doing signals for the first round, and in the second round, we see her starting to do signals with Dongmin's alliance, thinking that Junsok picked Beggar, only for him to have picked Cartel, with the reveal that Jungmoon accidentally did another signal after her initial one, and Dongmin only saw the second one, which is kind of like, hey, maybe you should like pay attention to what your signals are. But by the time around 3, we do see a lot of players end up lying about their roles, only for Dongmin's alliance to still get garnets here, with Junsok being upset at how are they reading our moves, only for us to see in this moment that Kyunghoon reveals to Junsok that Jungmoon's being sus. Leading to round 4, where we do see Junsok starting to watch the other team for their reactions, to which we have them keeping Jungmoon in the side room for the rest of the game, so that she can't communicate with the other team, which is, again, kind of weird. Or again, if you're Jungmoon, like, why not at that point just like completely flip to the other side? I mean, like, do you really want to be working with people that are like literally trapping you in a room? Though even beyond this, we do see Dongmin's alliance still getting one over on Junsok's alliance, with him proceeding to get 4 garnets for himself in round 5, even without Jungmoon's help, leading to round 6, where things seem to be going according to plan for Junsok's team, where they're in a position where they're about to completely outplay Dongmin. All they need to do is have Kyunghoon pick Beggar for him to take the lead, only for him to pick Cartel instead, leading to this, again, pretty funny moment of, again, us seeing like Junsok and Kyunghoon like preparing to celebrate, only for Kyunghoon to just mess it all up, and he acts confused over what he did wrong, while Kyungran ends up getting 4 garnets for herself in this round instead. But by the end of round 7, we do see all of Dongmin's alliance plus Kyunghoon ending up at the top of the leaderboard with 9 or 10 garnets, all while the rest of Kyunghoon's alliance are at the bottom, which I wonder if that's purposeful. But it's at this point that we do see Dongmin talking to his group about potentially getting a joint win, though based on what we currently know, that would be improbable, considering there are 4 of them, and 2 of them are at 9 garnets, 2 of them are at 10. And considering there's only 1 round left, and how garnets are distributed in that final round, again, it makes it pretty much impossible for a 4-person alliance to allow only 2 of those members to get 1 garnet, while the other 2 don't get anything at all, at least purposely. So again, it makes you question, how are they going to get a joint win? I wonder if they have another contingency plan. But again, this is a point where we do see players being able to give away their garnets, to where we do see Kyunghoon giving Yunsong a garnet here, with, again, at this point, him just trying to escape last place, only for Jungmoon to be upset over being in last now and freaking out when round 8 begins as the last opportunity to give away garnets, which this obviously ends up being the moment from the flash forward, which ultimately doesn't do much. Or again, I think when you see the freak out initially, you would think, oh, it's because Dongmin's alliance betrayed her, when like that's not really what's happening here. Obviously, it's just a very different circumstance. And in this spot, we do end up seeing her complaining about wanting extra time because they didn't warn them beforehand, to which production allows it, which I found that very confusing. Like, why did they do this? Anyway, it leads to Jungmoon negotiating a plan for all the players on the bottom to attempt to get joint last place, which I question, like, why did they agree to that? So we do end up having Junsuk giving Jungmoon a garnet here so that them alongside Yeonsung are all tied at 7. Obviously not the optimal play for any of them here, but I guess they just felt bad. Or again, I'll at least give Jungmoon credit in that sense. The fact that, again, she at least like is such a self-preservation based player that she was able to get her fellow alliance members to be essentially willing to put themselves in danger, again, kind of just because they felt bad for her, which, again, at least that's something. But it's at this moment that we do see Junsuk attempting to make a deal here with Dongmin for him to betray his group and give Kyunghoon the win in exchange for the token, which, I mean, to be fair, again, is beneficial to him in the sense that obviously it avoids a joint win at the top, which was the worst case scenario, and through that, again, giving more options for the main match. And again, if he is able to avoid being the sole loser, it makes it very unlikely that he's going to deathmatch, as you would assume that his allies are likely to pick the other side as the people that are going to the deathmatch. So where, again, I get the strategy here. Problem is that, again, it's just never going to work. But again, this leads into the final round where, again, we're led to believe that Kyunghoon's about to win for himself here, where, and it was a position where he was primed to do so, where had he just picked police, he does end up winning on his own. All at the same time, we do see him and Yeonsung create a plan that would have Yeonsung also picking police to escape being last himself, which, again, I guess is also why he went through the plan, because he had a backup in that sense. But none of that really ends up mattering as we get the reveal that Kyunghoon picked Cartel instead, giving Kyunghoon, Jinho, and Dongmin a garnet here in a spot where they all had 9, while again, Yeonmin and Kyungran already had 10, leading to a 5-way tie between Kyunghoon and Dongmin's entire alliance, where clearly something is up there. And this is where we obviously get the big reveal for the episode. Again, another classic genius style moment here, where again, we were meant to believe this entire time that Jungmoon was the like sole traitor that got caught, and it was just Dongmin outplaying the rest throughout the rest of the game. All while, again, it's at this moment that we flash back to the beginning of the game, where we obviously get the reveal now that Dongmin made the exact same deal he made with Jungmoon with Kyunghoon as well, meaning that their side actually had 2 spies working for them, which I will say, again, terrible alliance management, I guess, from Junsuk and Yeonsung, who were just like completely outplayed this entire time. But again, we see him making signals as well, and this obviously just recontextualizes this entire game here. Again, having the moment where Kyunghoon ends up shutting out Jungmoon was kind of like a double-sided thing, making himself now the sole spy for the other side, making them more reliant on him, also diverting attention from him and putting the blame onto Jungmoon, and also explaining how Dongmin was getting his way even after Jungmoon was isolated, and also revealing that the moments of Kyunghoon messing up in the earlier rounds were actually purposeful. Now, I will question, again, did he need to do this? He didn't really need to betray his team. He actually had the win already. Or again, he could have just won on his own. Didn't really need to go for his joint win. But again, he reveals that his motivation behind all this is because he wants revenge for Sangmin by taking out Junsuk, which, like, why now? Been a few rounds. Also, beyond that, you don't even fall through this. I don't know why he's doing this. Also, Junsuk is like a much better ally for him than someone like Jinho or Kyungran, who have never worked with him in the past. Again, I really don't understand this logic here, and this doesn't really feel like a move that's in his best interest. But whatever. With that, we do end up seeing Junsuk and Jungmoon being tied as the losers here, with Junsuk obviously being picked for a death match, as obviously he's the bigger threat of the two. Though, because again, there's a joint win between the top 5, the only people he can pick from are Jungmoon and Yeonsung, his 2 allies, which is obviously not a great spot to be in. And we do have to see him like ham this up a bit, asking them to pick a number, though ultimately that didn't matter anyway. Again, he was always going to pick Yeonsung, which I will say also feels like somewhat questionable choice, as again, it felt like him and Yeonsung had a decent working relationship. While I get that him and Jungmoon are probably closer, especially considering they were together in season 1, and she's, again, someone that he talks about keeping around because she's easier to beat at the end, it's still a person that is just such an unreliable ally that I do think I probably would have just taken out Jungmoon in this spot to, again, at least keep around a stable strategic player. Anyway, we have them having to exclude 1 game each at this point, with Junsuk picking double-sided poker, while Yeonsuk picks same picture hunt. Really arbitrary picks here. Again, we didn't really get them explained in any way, and it's not like Yeonsung is like a master at double-sided poker, and it's not like Junsuk would be that great at same picture hunt. So again, it's like really a spot here where none of this seems to matter. But either way, the game that gets selected here ends up being Monorail, which is a game that, again, I do really like on paper. Obviously, again, it ends up being broken, as we'll see. But I still think it makes for a pretty good television product every time we see it. I do find it funny how we do proceed to see Yeonsang being helped out here and given advice by Dongmin, best monorail player ever, I guess. And again, to be fair, obviously he's had time to prepare since last season, and I'm sure he was coming up with strategies in the lead up to this, considering, again, it's well known that Dongmin did a lot of prep for these death matches. But still, it's, again, kind of funny considering how fluky his actual monorail win was the last season. But anyway, we get to the death match where we see Junsuk going first and instantly putting 3 tiles on the side, leading to a lot of confusion here, with Yeonsang instantly thinking that's impossible, and taking a while to think about this, only for Junsuk to pretend to be confused, only for Kyunghoon to reveal that he's just acting. With the reveal now that Kyunghoon was helping Junsuk and showed him his optimal strat for monorail, because again, monorail's broken if people know what they should be doing here. Though, again, for some reason told Junsuk, which makes no sense based on the storyline of the episode. We literally just shown that Kyunghoon betrayed Junsuk's alliance because he wanted to take out Junsuk because he wanted revenge for Sangmin, only for him to now save Junsuk by telling him the optimal strat, which again just makes no sense. And again, the strategic decision is not explained. Now, technically, we did see beforehand that Yeonsang did tell Kyunghoon that he could keep all of his garnets if he went home, to where I wonder if that incentivized Kyunghoon to be letting him loose here. Yeah, again, it's not really explained in the show what Kyunghoon's actual rationale is in this position. But again, the strategy that Kyunghoon ends up utilizing here is essentially, again, just an auto win if you go first, as this sets up a track that can only be finished in one way. So in that spot, your opponent can either call impossible, to which, again, you'll be able to finish the track, or continue to play the game in a spot where, again, if they do still lay out the optimal path, you can still play it out in a way that you're going to be the person to actually finish the track by the end, to which, again, you would win. Or if your opponent messes up the track, which, again, there's only one track that could actually finish, then you could just call impossible at that point and they lose. Where, again, it's essentially just an auto win if you go first, which, again, is why this game is so broken. But does lead to Yeonsang eventually calling impossible and Junsuk finishing the track, to where, again, Yeonsang ends up being sniped out of the game in this spot. And I thought Yeonsang had an interesting season here in a spot where, obviously, he's not one of the more focused players on this cast. Again, this is a season that does feel very top-heavy in terms of who exactly got screen time, and Yeonsang is not one of those people. However, I do think he showed a bit more game ability on this season than he did in season 3. While obviously his result is worse than the last season, I do feel like he definitely demonstrated a lot more ability to play in a more cutthroat way. Again, we saw him obviously in Fish Shop playing a very aggressive way there and win there. Even in Garnet Thief here, again, he was playing very individualistically, and again, was trying to make side deals with Kyunghoon to stay out of the bottom. And again, I feel like that's a type of Yeonsang that we didn't really see in season 3, to where, again, I do think he stepped up his game for season 4, but ultimately, again, still was outplayed by the likes of Dongmin and Hyungmin once again. Though, again, I think he did show himself as a pretty capable player on this season, but one that is still, again, a bit outclassed by the best of the best on the board. And now for episode 7, which for me is kind of the point where I feel like the season goes a little bit downhill, to where, while it's not bad from this point forward, I just feel like there's just an overwhelming sense of just kind of mid from my point of view. And again, this is ingenious standards, where, again, mid-genius is still better than most other reality shows. But I do think this is a spot where, on the rewatch here, I think the season just becomes a lot less interesting from episode 7 on. Again, not without its good moments here and there, and without its satisfying conclusion to storylines, but still a position where I just think the first half of the season, again, outside of episode 5, is just so much stronger than what we end up getting in the back portion of the season here. By the way, the episode does start with Jinho and Kyungran being the first to enter, to which we hear them talking about making a season 1 alliance because they're up 4-3. Though they're worried about Junsuk, because Junsuk's definitely the person that you should be worried about in that group. Though, again, we do hear them talking about Dongmin and Hyungmin being close and getting to the end again, because, again, they'll surely do something about that. But here we do end up seeing Kyunghoon having a pretty massive Garnet lead at this point with 17. And there already being more Garnets in the prize pool than that of seasons 2 or 3, where, again, it was mentioned earlier in the season that the season was built with a 200 Garnet prize in mind, which, again, they don't quite hit. Though, again, I do respect the fact that they obviously actively tried to make a much grander prize pool here for the final season, in a spot where, again, the other season's prizes were pretty pitiful. Anyway, we get to the 7th main match, which is Seed Poker, which, weird in the Genius to see a poker game be a main match, though It's actually a game that I do like, though I do question if it made for the greatest TV, where I do think it probably was the most riveting television product, even though, again, I think there's interesting mechanics to this game. First, the fact that obviously it's a game of poker where you're playing with cards 1 through 15, though each player obviously gets 1 card, while the other 8 cards are placed in the middle of the table. Top card of that ends up becoming the first seed card, where each player gets an opportunity to accept a card or add a card. Accepting a card allows for you to get a new card and potentially swap it out with your own, to which that card will be discarded, all while adding a card adds a card seed to the pile, though there can only be 3 seed cards at a time. And obviously, again, you can assess the odds of what card that's going to be based on, again, what's in the discard pile. Now, beyond that, obviously, it plays out similarly to a betting game, though the interesting aspect of all this is how the seed cards are distributed, where after the betting takes place, the seed cards end up being distributed to those that bet, with the highest seed card going with the lowest card in their hand. That is until they run out, adding this, again, very interesting set of dynamics here that, again, I do like as a game. I do think this is, again, as a game, a very interesting combination of mechanics here, where, again, you have to assess if you'll get high enough seed card to beat the other combinations of seed cards and base cards. The fact that you also have to assess which seed card you will get, again, assessing if you have the lowest card in your hand. Again, there's a lot of like interesting dynamics in play here that, again, I think is a very interesting game to play. I just personally don't feel like a lot of that necessarily translated to the show itself. But here we do also see them get a rehearsal round for some reason, where it is here where we, again, get some more setup aspects of this game with the realization that the players that go later have an advantage, being able to essentially decide how the round plays out, which, again, feels very similar to like Horror Race in that light, where obviously you get more information the more the turn goes, and, again, knowing who exactly is betting and who isn't allows for you to assess who's getting which card better, and, again, ultimately figure out who's going to win each hand. But also here we see that seat order matters quite a bit as well, as the seat order remains the same the entire game. Now, obviously, turn order shifts from round to round, but, again, who you're seated next to does not change, which obviously gives you a lot more incentive to be working with those that you're sitting next to, in a spot where, obviously, again, there's a lot of deal making in this game, as, again, who bets and who folds in certain situations can change a lot of who gets what specific cards, which, again, we do see a lot of whispering at the table made around, though, again, I don't think it made for the greatest TV at points. And feeling kind of similar to like whispering at Tribal Council, where I don't feel like we were really looped into everything that was happening here. But either way, we do see Junseok and Jungmoon working together, agreeing to use their fingers as symbols to tell each other what each other have, only for them to be sat right next to each other, which is really disfavoring them here, where, again, it ends up having the typical suspects also sitting all next to each other that typically work together, with, again, Jinho and Kyungran on the other side, pairing up with Kyunghoon and Hyungmin, Dongmin actually being seated in the middle, allowing him to really work both sides. And, again, very strange seeing him work with Junseok and Jungmoon in this position. We've never seen him really work with before this, and it's funny because, again, him and Junseok are essentially in lockstep throughout this round, which I never expected to see. But anyway, the game ends up starting here. Dongmin obviously hamming up his relationship with the dealer, as you would expect. Always see Kyungran and him winning rounds 1 and 2, with the backing of Jinho, giving her the initial lead, with obviously their plan being to give Kyungran the win. All by round 4, we do see, again, a bit more whispering at the table, with Dongmin trying to work with Hyungmin, though, again, Kyunghoon's in the middle of them. So we have Kyunghoon being the middleman, in a spot where Dongmin has to wake him up, which is, again, a bit weird. Again, ends up being kind of funny content there. But we do see Dongmin being able to get everybody to fold here, giving him the win in round 4, with also the reveal here that Jinho and Kyungran are trying to protect Dongmin for some reason. Again, I guess good on Dongmin's social game. So again, it seems like Dongmin is in a pretty powerful position, being kind of in the middle of the two groups. That is, until Jungmoon decides to blow that up by ratting out Dongmin to Kyungran and Jinho, and Kyunghoon, who's also there, which, I mean, is a very Jungmoon thing to do, and again, just very sloppy play, definitely unnecessary here. Just potentially blows up your spot, and what do you know? Kyunghoon tells Dongmin, it's where he now makes it his goal to turn everyone against Jungmoon. To where, again, by the end of this game, again, Jungmoon essentially turns literally everybody against her, which, I know there was a lot of criticism for my placement of Jungmoon on my ranking of every player, with a lot of people just really bashing on Jungmoon as a player. And while, again, I still probably do stand by my opinion of Jungmoon as a player, especially because I do respect a lot of her individuality in the game, I do feel like it is moments like this that, again, definitely very sloppy. And I definitely understand why people have a low opinion of Jungmoon. Or even by the end of this game, we see Junseok even being on board taking out Jungmoon, despite the fact that he's been a loyal ally of hers up to this point. But again, we do see Dongmin being really resolute in trying to make her the loser, only for Jinho to not fall through that plan, and just essentially going through with his previous plan, just backing Kyungran. But it's a spot where, again, Jinho does have a relationship with Jungmoon from previous seasons, along the fact that there's not really a guaranteed way to make Jungmoon lose here, to where, again, he doesn't fall through this plan. And also, we do get the reveal here that he actually ratted himself to Jungmoon, the fact that the others are against her, which leads to him trying to save her in this spot, which, again, she certainly won't mess up. But coming to the final round here, we do get the reveal that for Dongmin to win, Kyunghoon would have to come in last, to which we see Kyunghoon volunteering for the death match to save his team, which, again, like, weird. Again, finally doing essentially what Dongmin always says he's going to do, but never does. But again, Kyunghoon actually does it here. Manyu does it in exchange for garnets if he does survive, but still, again, throws himself into the death match. Kind of insane here from Kyunghoon. Obviously, you can tell has a certain player in mind that he thinks he can beat in the death match. But anyway, in the final round itself, we do see Jinho still trying to give Kyungran the win, and essentially in a spot to do so, Jungmoon bets, only for Jungmoon to fold, give Dongmin the win over Kyungran for some reason. Again, just continuing the terrible play here from Jungmoon, obviously pissing off Jinho here, burning the only person that was actually trying to keep you in the game at this point, all saying that she's doing this to not get thrown to the death match. You're gonna get thrown to the death match anyway. And if anything, you probably actually have more leverage if Kyungran had won, where in that spot, maybe you can convince Jinho to be willing to give up the token to her for giving them the win. I do think this is a bizarre play here, but anyway, Kyunghoon ends up being the death match candidate here, to which Dongmin ends up giving his token to Hyunmin, because why not, I guess. Oh, Kyunghoon pretends like he's gonna pick Jinho or Kyungran, saying that he really wants to take on Jinho, again, to be the Kingslayer, only from the, obviously, pick Jungmoon instead. With now the reveal that Kyunghoon had talked to Jinho and Kyungran and made a deal with them after they revealed to him that Jungmoon was helping them out too. Again, it's actually just having the entire cast just corroborate their stories of Jungmoon just being a rat, which, again, I think is actually a funny conclusion to Jungmoon's story here. Again, the fact that she really just faces the comeuppance for just how much of a rat she ends up being across the season. It's kind of like a very fitting way for her to go here. But anyway, we do get to the deathmatch selection with Kyunghoon getting rid of Gohap, obviously something that Jungmoon is notoriously good at. Oh, well, Jungmoon gets rid of 12 Jonggi, which, again, you would assume Kyunghoon would be good at. To which the game that gets selected here ends up being Same Picture Hunt, which on paper, this very much felt like a very even matchup. It felt like one that I think both could do well at. It's literally just a memory test. The problem is that Same Picture Hunt's kind of a boring death match. And again, this was just so boring for the show itself, and also kind of predictable where this is going to head from a storyline perspective, at least. To where obviously Kyunghoon ends up winning here in a spot where he did get pretty fortunate with him being able to reveal his tiles pretty early on, and ultimately just blows Jungmoon away here, being able to actually finish the entire track, which, again, never seen before. To which Jungmoon ends up being eliminated here of the show, saying that he's a talented spy, but the important task is to avoid recognition, which makes you question, if she can't do that, is she actually a talented spy then? But anyway, at least Jungmoon, who, again, I already said my piece on her. Again, I think she was a rat across the season, but I thought it was a fun rat. I know some people are annoyed by Jungmoon, how terrible she plays at points in the season. I still, again, have respect for, again, how self-interested she is as a player, and while, again, it can be frustrating to see her certainly do things against her own best interest at points, I still found her to be an interesting character on this season, especially when she's in these moments of panic of her trying to save herself out of desperation. Again, I see of the online community that just seems to hate Jungmoon. Again, I think she's probably an underrated character, and again, not a good player, but one that I thought at least made for interesting TV. And now for episode 8, which ends up being another just kind of mid episode, one that it should have been much better than what it is, considering it's the return of a very notable main match that I really liked from the past, though it ultimately doesn't play on an interesting way from my perspective. But by the way, the episode does start with Dongmin and Junsuk being the first to enter and talking about working together now. If only that led to anything. Oh, we do get a lot of focus around Kyungran being the last woman left, which, again, surely will last, but this does lead to another conversation about names and how Kyungran and Kyunghoon have almost the same name but different symbols, and them then calling back to the Min talk back from the premiere, and this leading into Kyunghoon talking about wanting to be Kyungran's dog. Surely Kyunghoon will work with Kyungran across this episode. This leads into the 8th main match of the season, that being Minus Auction 2. Again, the return of Minus Auction from Season 2, which was one of my favorite main matches in that appearance, being one that was just so much fun for the show. And it was rewatching here in Season 4 that made me realize that it was just because of the people involved. Now again, the game functions very similarly to how it worked last time, where again you have to use chips or garnets to pass on cubes, with the person with the highest sum by the end wins, though obviously if you get consecutive numbers, only the top number will count, and also you get points for every chip that you have. So again, a lot of interesting dynamics in play here, a really interesting match, especially when added in the aspect of a cube being removed, which could just screw over a certain player, adding a level of randomness to it. However, an additional aspect of this game is the fact that a second cube will be excluded from the game as well, with that cube being put up for auction during round 17. To the player that wins that auction will get info on what the cube is and will decide on whether or not to add that cube back to the game. Again, an interesting addition here, though it doesn't really change too much, yet it actually ends up being the only real intrigue of this entire match anyway. Anyway, the game starts with them doing a Mexican wave, which is like a stadium wave. I generally did not know it was called a Mexican wave. And again, straight up, as much as I do love Minus Auction Season 2, I did find Season 4 appearance here just to be, again, just kind of boring, where there's not really many fun character interactions like in Season 2. Outside of Dongman making a funny face when saying 6 chips for some reason. Again, I don't get if this was a reference to something I didn't know, but also there were many interesting deals being made, and again, really the main intrigue comes from that mysterious second missing cube. Them using Assassin's Creed 4 music once again during the auction as well. But again, we do see Kyung-hoon having the most garnets coming into this match by a lot. Again, he was already given garnets by Yunsung. He then made a deal for garnets with Dongmin to go into the deathmatch. He also made a deal for garnets with Jinho and Kyungran to keep them safe. But finally, by the end of this, Kyung-hoon ends up dropping from first in garnets all the way to last over the course of just a single main match. He ends up having what should be a massive advantage coming into this match, considering it obviously allows him to save chips and ultimately allows for him to win the auction for the mystery second cube, which he proceeds to say is -20, a number that Dongmin needs, to where we do see Kyung-hoon offering to add it back to the game for garnets, only for Dongmin to not acquiesce, and for him to get rid of the cube, which will surely never be mentioned again. Though it is funny that despite this entire play here, we do see players like clearly knowing that this is that Dongmin and Kyung-hoon are working together, where it's clear that this is something to not really be taken too seriously. But this also ends up being a position where Kyungran needs -26 or she's screwed. And she's relieved here to hear that -20 is the mystery cube, which, again, wonder where that's going. And who would have guessed it? -20 comes up. Now it's known that Kyung-hoon lied the entire time. There's this debate now what the mystery cube is. And again, the formal reveal that Dongmin and Kyung-hoon are working together, even though the others already suspected that. But again, later we do end up seeing -26 turn out to be one of the hidden cubes. But again, surely not the cube that Kyung-hoon got rid of. And that surely wasn't intentional. Anyway, this obviously leads to Kyungran losing here. Though we do end up seeing Kyung-hoon in a spot where he could go for a joint win alongside Junsok if he just lets him have the final cube, only for him to once again not take that win for some reason, which he does later explain, but even then it was a dumb explanation. So instead, he gives up the win while also making Junsok not win here, while also giving the win to Jinho, which is surprising considering Jinho's strategy this entire time was to go for the high cubes and hope to reconcile it with chips, which, and we saw not be a particularly effective strategy the first time this was played. So again, kind of funny that Jinho won with that strategy this time. Always see him give the token to Hyungmin because they had made an agreement because they had the same strategy and they made a deal on which cubes to go for, which again somehow worked out for them, I guess. Oh, while we obviously did see Junsok working against Dongmin by the end of this game, trying to make side deals and obviously again try to get a joint win with Kyung-hoon. So again, that alliance with Dongmin certainly mattered. Either way, Kyungran here ends up deciding to pick Dongmin, as if she were to lose, who'd be the person that she would want to lose to? Boy, does she lose. But again, they both get to eliminate one game, with Kyungran taking out 12 Jongi, which, fair. All Dongmin takes out Quattro, again, the least gameable game, and probably the only game that he didn't have an overwhelmingly high chance at beating Kyungran in. But either way, the deathmatch ends up being Gyalhap, though again, modified for whatever reason, and the fact that they changed the pictures to now be green, orange, and purple, instead of red, blue, and yellow, and sun, moon, stars, instead of circles, squares, and triangles. Again, it's not that much of a difference. But again, this is another, like, kind of perfect deathmatch choice here. Again, this potential redemption for Kyungran, who obviously lost the Gyalhap the first time around. That's what lost her Season 1, only for her to proceed to lose the game again, and this time in an even worse fashion here. Again, also being a great moment for Dongmin, really just showing his complete dominance in this game, where he completely demolishes her, revealing that he had been practicing, talks through his, like, optimal strat for finding all the combinations. Tori ends up, again, blowing her away in a 57-9 result here, which is just pure insanity. It really just show how much better Dongmin is at this game than pretty much everyone else on the board. And the episode ends up ending with Kyungran leaving, asking what cube did Kyunghoon throw away, with us getting this big reveal, like at the very end of the episode, that the cube he threw away was negative 26. I can't believe it. Revealing that Dongmin and Kyunghoon had a secret alliance all along, and they knew that Kyungran was set to lose by getting rid of negative 26. Again, I can't believe that that's this revelation. That definitely didn't feel intentional beforehand. And again, that's really just the main intrigue of this episode, in a spot where it was just kind of predictable that was going to happen. Again, just did not turn out to be that interesting of a revelation here. But also through this, again, we do get the reveal of Kyunghoon's motivation for why he threw the main match. And that's because he couldn't abandon his team today. Doesn't make any sense. Now, again, I get that him going for a joint win Junsok would have left Dongmin vulnerable, with him and Junsok safe, and again, making it more likely that Dongmin goes into deathmatch. The problem is that, again, Dongmin's going to deathmatch anyway. And by doing this, now you're just burning Junsok and not having immunity. Or again, this move just makes no sense to me. But especially as it's not like Dongmin is instantly going into deathmatch by going through this plan. It's not like he's like fundamentally setting him in. You're just risking your own game for no real reason. But either way, again, we lose Kyungran here. And Kyungran, again, I've said in the past, I do think is probably a tad overrated as a player. I do think she's a player that is propped up as the greatest female player of the Genius. And to be fair, based on record, again, you could definitely say that. And if someone wants to claim that, again, I'm not going to necessarily fully disagree with that take. But the spot here where Kyungran, again, well, having a fine run on the season, again, definitely felt like, again, a bit out of depth here. Again, really demonstrated by just her being completely demolished by Dongmin at the end here. But even beyond that, again, just kind of in and out of the majority at points. Even when she was in the majority, didn't really feel like she was like particularly integral to her team's success. That being said, I don't think this is necessarily like a terrible appearance from her. It's really just more of what we saw in season 1 of, again, her being a competent main match competitor. Also like a competent enough deathmatch competitor to where while she rarely goes into deathmatch, she's not like terrible. She's just, again, simply not as good as the best of the best. And amongst this field, it just felt like a spot where, again, Kyungran didn't really have much of a chance to ultimately win. So again, this is just an appearance that just gave us more of what you would expect from Kyungran, of her, again, just being a competent but just kind of inconsistent player by the end. But now for episode 9, an episode that I never particularly loved, though, too. I probably like it a bit more on the rewatch than I remember, with this just being another typical episode of feeling pretty baseline from the beginning, though, again, having a reveal towards the end that, again, makes it a little bit more interesting, I guess. But anyway, the first players to enter here end up being Dongmin and Jinho, with them talking about how Junsok betrayed Dongmin at the end of the last mean match. This ends up leading to a lot of talk about how Junsok's the dark horse, and really just setting up him as a target for this round. But we do eventually get the reveal that there are going to be guests for this main match, with all the remaining main matches having guests, which is weird that minus Auction 2 ends up being the last main match without any guests. And the guests here end up being returning players, feeling like those that missed out on the cut for the season. And I find it funny how, like, they're not really held in any, like, real reverence here. They're actually kind of mocked throughout this entire episode. But, you know, we first get introduced to Poong, who's instantly mocked for his note-taking. And then we get to Doohee, who is mocked for the ID incident, which also I'll say, like, the fact that they add in, like, 2 Jinho allies here feels like, again, a bit leading, even though, to be fair, it's not like Jinho ends up working with both of them in this spot. And again, we do have Jinho, like, instantly mocking them, calling them small fries, only for Ah Young to enter, the first victim of Kyunghoon's betrayal, because that's surely the only reason why you would bring Ah Young back. And then we get Jungbom, who, again, I found really funny. Where, like everyone else, they introduced them through a series of clips. Jungbom is literally introduced with just the one shot of him, just showing him trying to memorize that phrase from his black mission that he failed. But then we get to the final guest that comes in, and it's Bandage Man, aka Sangmin with a face mask. Which I'll say, as much as I do love, again, having Sangmin back here, I don't love the inconsistency and the fact that, again, Sangmin's obviously a player that was on this season while the other ones weren't. Again, I would have loved it more if, again, this was like maybe someone like Sungyu or something like that. But either way, we do obviously get some fun dynamics here from Kyunghoon bowing down to him and saying he kept him in his heart, and proceeds to try to hug him, only for Sangmin to dodge his hug. But either way, we do get to the 9th main match, that being Horror Race 2. Again, keeping this tradition of when guests come in, they end up replaying a game that was played earlier. And in this game, we have the players and the guests playing individually, but end up being ranked separately by the end, with the guests obviously playing for their own separate prize money. And the game itself ends up being mostly in line with last time, but again, with slight modifications, like the movement tiles are now 1, 2, and 3 instead of 1, 2, and 4. Also, there's the addition of piggybacking, where when a character moves onto a space within another character, they'll then move alongside that piece the next time that piece moves. Also, we get the addition of puddles, which stops pieces at specific points, seemingly to, again, stop people from getting too much of a lead. And really, all these things don't really add too much to the game. It just feels like changes for the sake of it, where it felt like the more interesting dynamics here came from these returning players being added in, even though even there, it's more so from just how they affected the game, more so than like them actually getting that much screen time. But anyway, we see the players being given their coins where they realize that there's no metal inside them now, where, again, by this point, episode 2 had likely aired. So, again, they removed the trick from earlier, as again spoiled there. All while Dongmin instantly notices that the white disc is bigger this time than last time. I don't know how he instantly knew that. But anyway, we see Jungbom and Doohee instantly working together. That's about all we get from them. Where, again, funny how despite, again, these returning players being brought back here, most of this episode really just neglects them, with these two in particular being near purple here, having almost no relevance to the actual results of the episode. It's kind of no wonder they weren't brought back for grand final. But we do get a lot of focus around Kyung-hoon's interactions here, with Poong pulling him over right away and saying that he likes him as he's an unconventional player, and says that he has slightly sociopathic eyes and that he really likes that about him, which is such an insane thing to say. Oh, we see Kyung-hoon telling Ah-young that he wants to give her the win, only for Ah-young to say she's not falling for it this time, only for him to do the same thing with Sangmin, only for Sangmin to tell him to work with Junsok. With the implication here being that Sangmin's sending him over to spy on Junsok for him and rat out information, which, again, we'll later get a bit more context to this. Also getting Hyungmin to help back Kyung-hoon, with Hyunmin thinking that he'll get the token from Kyung-hoon, in a spot where Hyunmin really spends most of this main match here being really outplayed by everyone else around him, thinking that he's like running things. Again, feeling very similar to what happened on Fish Shop, where he just thinks he's in this dominant position when he really wasn't, where we do see him attempting to make a deal with Dongmin, to try to trick Dongmin into helping Kyung-hoon to win, only for Dongmin to instantly know that he's lying to him, where in reality we see Dongmin really working with Jinho here instead. And again, it just really felt like a spot here where Kyungmin is clocked from the very beginning. But we see them choosing their characters, where we see almost everyone seem to pick a different combination, clearly learning from how it played out last time, and obviously trying to get more tokens in the box for each of the characters, where by the end it ends up being a much more balanced affair here. But right away, we do see Kyung-hoon ratting out Junsok's picks to Sangmin here, all while picking characters that Sangmin told him to instead of what Junsok told him to, which again will surely benefit Kyung-hoon in this game. Oh, we see Poong, Sangmin, and Ah-young all agree to an alliance to share the prize money when they win. And with them also being in the majority of the returning players in this spot, it does give them a lot of influence in this game, though we don't quite see that influence just yet. But anyway, round 1 starts, where we do get a pretty fun Sangmin moment of him like really gloating over how he can pick all 3 of the same color, only to only get 2, only for Hyungmin to immediately then get all 3, but seemingly by accident. But along the way, we also get some more fun Dongmin Ah-young interactions, as you would expect, them just like constantly scaring her and Ah-young just being Ah-young. But here we do have seeing Hyunmin and Kyung-hoon ending up backing red and blue, which do end up moving in the first round, only for Kyung-hoon to have the opportunity in round 2 to further take the lead, only to not do it, which again is just such a Kyung-hoon thing to do, where we get the reveal that Kyung-hoon doesn't actually want to win. This time because he doesn't want to be the one making the decision between Hyungmin and Junsok. Seems dumb, especially this late into the game. Again, I feel like you keeping your social capital with Kyungmin and Junsok doesn't really do that much at the Final Four. So I feel like you're just better off just getting immunity. Through that, again, it allows Dongmin to take the lead in this spot, leading to Hyungmin eventually abandoning ship and trying to get in with Dongmin and pretend like he was with him the entire time, when obviously, again, he's right through that. And again, you can just clearly tell how irresponsive Dongmin's being to him, just asking for the token, yet Hyungmin doesn't seem to really pick up on that. But we finally do end up showing the reality of this game, focusing around what Poong, Sangmin, and Ah-young are doing, when we get this big reveal after Ah-young is able to get blue to move on 2 and 3 in a singular round, all while green is piggybacking, essentially winning the game for those coins, with the reveal that they were really just running circles around everyone else, and that instead of working with Kyung-hoon as implied earlier, their goal was actually to throw Kyung-hoon and Junsok into the deathmatch, which I will say, again, it is a bit unfair that obviously these players with these vendettas are coming in with the intention of taking out people in the game itself. Again, that definitely feels a bit cheap as a way to send them home. Again, just obviously messing with their games, which is a tad unfair, but it does obviously recontextualize the events of the episode, where again, we obviously saw Sangmin telling Kyung-hoon to work with Junsok earlier, which we assume was so that Kyung-hoon could rat out information to Sangmin, which to be fair is part of it, but also so they could be working together so they could both lose together. Now, I will say, I don't fully understand the idea of him getting Hyungmin to back Kyung-hoon, as that felt like a bit unnecessary, as again, like, why not just like lead Hyungmin on? I don't know why they need to like have him working with the other side, maybe just to cause dissension, I guess, with Kyung-hoon and him be split between Hyungmin and Junsok. But again, I didn't really understand that part of the plan. And this is all while the reality is that Sangmin was actually working with Dongmin and Jinho. Thank God the Winners Alliance finally came through. Though I will say, like, this definitely felt a bit favored towards them. Obviously, this is a position where the returning players in this spot are people that, again, have good relationships with Jinho and Dongmin. So again, that kind of gives them the advantage there, along with the fact that also, because of the type of match this is, where we have the returning players, it allows for, again, this majority group to be able to form that only includes 2 of the players that are still in the game, which allows, again, Dongmin and Jinho to work without much distrust between them, because, again, they know that if one wins, the other one gets the token. And, again, the structuring of this main match definitely felt like in a way that was going to essentially favor whatever duo in the main game that could get the backing of the majority of the returning players, where, again, they can help each other and don't have any real incentive to not help each other in that spot. Certainly they can both win, to where ultimately, again, it felt like this was something that definitely played a lot into Dongmin and Jinho's benefit here, whereas obviously allowed Kyung-hoon's ratting to Sangmin to really be him just ratting to the opposing alliance. All we see, again, the likes of Jinho and Poong spreading misinformation, lying about what characters they're backing, and ultimately getting the opposing alliance to back blue, and that's actually exactly what Dongmin needed. And again, it just felt like a spot here where Sangmin's alliance really just ran circles around the other players here who really just did not know what they were doing, and were just kind of goaded into playing into the majority's benefit here. But again, once the game results became pretty clear, we do see Kyung-hoon giving a final plea to Ah-young by getting on his knees and saying, "Nuna, my queen, my lord, please," which, again, what a simp. Again, only for her to not help him, shockingly, where the game does finish with Poong winning for the guests and proceeding to obviously share money with the other 2, leading to a shocked reaction from Jungbom, because he's in this episode. While Dongmin wins the game for the Genius players, ends up obviously giving the token to Jinho as expected, while Kyung-hoon loses and has to choose between Junsok and Hyungmin, with Junsok feeling safe. They did a promise between him and Kyung-hoon to protect each other as early boots, only for Kyung-hoon to obviously pick him for whatever reason. Again, funny that Junsok doesn't really take any of this personally, again, because this is a pretty big betrayal. He seems to take it in stride and actually ends up, again, giving Kyung-hoon his garnets by the end of the game. But again, I do question this as a decision for Kyung-hoon. Now, ultimately, it doesn't really matter that much, as, again, we're so late into the game that, again, each person has to go eventually, and again, it's a spot where Kyung-hoon still has a decent relationship with Hyunmin, and Hyunmin's obviously probably harder to beat in a deathmatch than Junsok. So again, you're risking your game more by taking on Hyunmin. So again, I kind of get why he makes this choice, though I actually do think Junsok might be a better ally for Kyung-hoon, though again, we're kind of at the point in the game where allies don't really matter as much. But anyway, we get to the deathmatch selection, which is only down to 3, so again, there's no more exclusions, to which, by random draw, ends up being Quattro. Though a radically different version of Quattro than what we saw before, where really with most of the death matches that end up returning, they come back in a pretty similar form to what they were originally, maybe some slight modifications. This version of Quattro ends up being a radically different game, where obviously the previous one was a more social-based game, where based on your connections with other players, you would swap cards. And even though this might be an unpopular opinion, I actually love the original version of Quattro. Again, it's kind of this perfect mix of the social strategy aspects of the game mixed in with a more genius component to it. And while at the end of the day, Quattro is a very luck-based game, and it always will be, I actually feel like that was probably my personal favorite iteration of it. Obviously, they changed it obviously for the final season 2 to make it so that you can't interact with the players, though again, it still is a game with social aspects to it, in the sense that you're still trading with your fellow players, just that you can't interact with them during the trades, to where, and that made it worse. However, I feel like here this just makes it into a radically different game, where instead of actual players, they're trading with virtual players, which I get the notion that obviously they did not know when this game would be played, and through that you would not know how many players there would be in the game to swap with, where again, I think from a practical standpoint, it kind of always had to be virtual players in this spot, as again, for all you know, it's going to be played at the final 3, where there's not going to be anyone else to play with. Where again, I get why they did this here, but it just makes this such a radically different game in a spot where there obviously aren't any social dynamics in play here. Instead, it's really you just swapping cards with these virtual players that will always give you the optimal card by the end, which obviously still has its own level of strategy to it, its own level of intrigue, but just again, just feels like a radically different game than what Quattro was originally meant to be. I don't think necessarily worse as a game for the Genius, just something that, but again, does take away from what I thought the initial intrigue was from the first iteration of Quattro. But anyway, we do get some interesting moments through his deathmatch. First, in the fact that they play a Walking Dead theme remix during it, which is weird. Oh, you also get Kyung-hoon being Kyung-hoon and asking the virtual players if they have certain cards, only for no response. response. How shocking. But Kyung-hoon does end up playing this pretty well, playing pretty optimally, not doing most of his trades until later in the game, where at that point you'll have more info as, again, whenever you trade a card, it ends up being revealed what card you trade away. Also being very fortunate to draw higher cards here, and by not trading, he obviously was allowed to hold on to them for longer, which essentially makes it so Junseok couldn't get those cards either. So again, I think he does play this game well, but ultimately, again, Quattro's still a game of a lot of luck involved. So he still had things work in his favor, which they ultimately do. Junseok getting fairly unlucky here, getting some lower cards. Ultimately, by the end, it really just comes down to, is Kyung-hoon going to get Quattro or not, to which he ultimately does. So again, he does pretty handily win here. And again, we lose Junseok, who, I mean, outside the show, questionable, especially in the years since, where again, he's become a big politician with some questionable beliefs. Though, as a genius player, I mean, I think he definitely demonstrated his potential here, where obviously he was the first boot on season 1, and that was the spot where he was taken out because he was looked at as a potential big threat. And in season 2, he has that guest appearance, and he really shows some of that ability by betraying everyone. And again, when we get to season 4 here, he really just shows the potential he had. Now, again, he was obviously playing from the bottom for most of the time. No one really trusted him, and he obviously did some very slimy things across the game that made people not trust him. Again, he is a pretty competent player. So again, seemingly decent death matches, definitely has a killer instinct in the game that I think is interesting to see play out, while obviously, again, he was outplayed at points across the season. I do think he came off as a very strong player in this appearance, especially for someone that originally started as the first boot of their season. And over episode 10, another episode that, again, just feels largely fine, fitting in line with a lot of the episodes we've just talked about, having a interesting main match and a fine death match, but one that really doesn't go to any extremes. But again, let's start off with Final 4 player recaps, with each player getting nicknames, because we need that, with Kyung-hoon being listed as the unpredictable Kingslayer, which surely won't be reiterated over and over again at this point. Hyunmin gets the greatest nickname of just being the youngest genius player. We have Dongmin again being called the most balanced extrasensory player, which, again, I've never seen the word extrasensory be used as much as it is here for Dongmin. Jinho is the, again, icon of the genius, which, again, you would expect. But really, in general, again, obviously this is a very strong Final 4. Again, a pretty near perfect Final 4 for a returnee season here. Going to have 2 of the show's winners, the best to never win, and again, an unpredictable wild card in Kyung-hoon getting towards the end. Again, it really does feel like this season, results-wise, plays out fairly well. This ends up being why I like to call it the Loved Ones episode, because again, it's funny to think of it that way. But again, it ends up being the episode where the players get to bring in their own guests, with us obviously getting introduced to them one by one. First with Jinho coming in with Gaiwan, his IT entrepreneur friend who he met on a show about gifted people, supposedly, which, again, he doesn't really show that in this episode. We get Dongmin coming on with Junyoung, a random researcher he met through reading his story, I guess. Again, this was a bizarre connection here, but also really funny how, like, the guy comes in and Jinho instantly mocks him for being old, only for him to be 30 younger than Jinho himself. But then we get to Hyungmin, who comes in with Kyunghan, Kyungran's friend from season 1, which is really random. It's really funny. Again, it's introduced to us here that the way they know each other is through meeting each other at the finale dinner for season 3, which is also very strange. But again, a nice little callback here to have a guest from season 1, but also, again, just feels like a potentially forced pairing here. But then we get to Kyung-hoon, who's actually with somebody that he seems to be close with, a friend from school that he names Cordyceps for whatever reason. But he ends up being really propped up as this prodigy, and he is the guest here that probably stands out the most, being a Genius superfan who did seem to be fairly skilled here. Where if had the Genius continued on, I feel like he actually would have been a pretty decent choice for a future season. But either way, we then eventually get to the 10th main match of the season, that being Cooperative Hold'em. Essentially a game of 2 games happening at the same time, with one being played by the Genius player, while the other is played by their helper, with the results of one affecting the other. Where one game is essentially just a game of Hold'em, with them using garnets to bet, with this being the last garnet match. And that portion of the game plays out as a typical betting game, though the main intrigue here comes from the fact that the community cards aren't random, and instead decided by the results of the other game, which are a series of mini games where the other player will be competing amongst each other in mini games where the winner gets to pick a community card, all knowing the cards that the other players have, allowing for this intrigue here, you having to gauge if the community card was chosen to benefit you from your partner or was chosen to goad you into betting, where really the winner of the first community card here is really incentivized to pick a card that will get their partner to bet, but also will trick someone else into doing so as well. Where again, I think this is actually a really cool game on paper, though I do think it's debatable how good of TV it necessarily is, where this is really just a glorified poker game. There's no real room for making deals or doing the typical things that, again, you would expect from the Genius. And obviously it's late into the game anyway, and you don't get much of that towards the end of the season. But again, I don't think this game necessarily plays to the strengths of the Genius, though it is a fairly competent game in its own right. But leading into the game beginning, we do get some content here from Kyung-hoon, who weirdly just out of the blue talks about how his plan is to not even try to win, but instead try to make Hyungmin last, which again, he'll surely succeed at. But it's also like, why? This isn't explained, where again, him and Hyungmin are supposedly friends, and doesn't make sense why he would actually want to do this outside the fact that I guess he just wants to further prop up that Kingslayer storyline so he can get to the final three of both of the kings, I guess. Again, I don't really even see any other true justification for this, but either way, the game is starting where the Genius players are made to play Hold'em while the helpers are playing the mini games. This obviously being switched across the game, though. We do see the helpers being taken to the mini game room, aka a dark room that just has a spotlight on the table that they're playing at, where they are introduced to each of the mini games, which I will say is probably criticism of this as a television product, particularly in the fact that these minigames are very hard to follow, and to be fair, the show doesn't even really make you want to follow them at all, as again, they happen so quickly, and they're really just an aspect of the format here utilized to determine the hold'em aspect of the game, but we still do end up seeing the players doing these games really quickly with no real context on their thought process throughout all this, where I do find that aspect of this game pretty weird, but the games themselves end up being rather basic as you would expect them to be. The first one here being Match, a game where you use a set of matchsticks to create a certain design where you can't have any sticks left over. Again, pretty basic there. Scale is just, again, a simple arithmetic based one where you have to balance out two scales using the numbers on it. All puzzles, literally just a tangram puzzle. And all very simple games are done very quickly here. But I always found it strange how there is technically a physical portion to this to a degree. Is that to submit your answer, you have to grab a stick in the middle of the room, which obviously, again, is probably the more fair way of handling all this, to, again, have a clear-cut winner here as the first person to grab the stick. Though it always feels weird to see people very aggressively going after this stick in a show like The Genius. And to be fair, again, it's not even anything that different from hitting a buzzer or putting stickers on people in Food Chain. Yeah, though I just always found this aspect of the game weird, even though again, it really probably shouldn't be. Though it is kind of funny how most of the guests here end up sucking at these mini games, where a lot of them get these wrong initially, with us again cutting to Dongmin just being annoyed at how long they're waiting, which I will say, for the players themselves, I could definitely see this game being one that's a bit tedious, as you do spend a lot of time just waiting for the other game to conclude. Beyond that, something I don't love about this game is obviously how important your partner ends up being to this game, where if you don't end up having a guest here that's good at the mini games, or you yourself aren't good at the mini games, you're essentially screwed in this game. And while again, you have a little bit more agency in the sense that you can decide who does the mini games, who does the betting, it still feels like a position here where it's really make or break just how good you or your partner are in these games. But right away, we do see Cordyceps being the best guest, that Match and Puzzle really helping Kyung-hoon during those rounds, all while Dongmin's friend demolishes the others at Scale, which helps him during rounds 2 and 5, which is another aspect of this game strategy that we don't see play out, though had they stuck in this format for longer, I feel like that is, again, something that is a tad gameable. If you're someone like Dongmin, you recognize that your partner's very good at Scale, then every 3 rounds, you know that it's very likely your partner won. So again, that's definitely something to consider here, though again, we never see it properly play out. And realistically, this actually ends up being a pretty weak start for Dongmin here, with him being tricked very early on by Cordyceps into betting in round 3, and then in round 4 he ends up being bluffed by Hyungmin, where again, not a great look for Dongmin. Though as this game goes on, we also see the presentation of it change here, where for the first few rounds, we obviously show the mini games first and then the Hold'em game. But starting from round 3, we do start to do a more Genius-like editing style here of obviously showing the Hold'em game first and then flashing back to the mini game when the Hold'em players find out what the cards are. Again, definitely playing to the strengths of the Genius format, though the issues that, again, there's not really any major reveals here that are too notable. But after round 5, we do have the helpers and players having to swap, which again is an aspect of the format I do like. It again allows obviously both sides to test out their ability in both aspects of the game, while also not being able to fully rely on just one player, while also giving information for the later choice, where after round 10, they have to pick one person to do each side and stick with it. So I do think the forcing of having both the player and the guest have to do both aspects of the game at the very beginning, again, was the correct way of handling this. But in round 6, we do get probably one of the few funny interactions across this episode, and what is, again, not a particularly humorous episode, but one that does have Jinho accidentally taking Dongman's pieces, causing his loss there. Oh, we have, again, a very meta moment here of, again, this setup, the cordyceps wanting an extreme ways moment, with the show really going all in on this and playing the music for him, only for him to end up folding. But coming into this, we do see Hyunmin being confident in his ability in these mini games, thinking he's going to win match, only for Dongmin to win instead, with the reveal that he's been playing this game since he was a kid, and he didn't have Legos, he had matchsticks. Again, just adding more reason why Dongmin's just perfectly suited for the genius, but it does leave Hyunmin annoyed that he's only the second best at any of these games. And again, not a particularly great look for Hyunmin, even though, again, obviously it turns around by the end of the match, but just another spot of them showing him as a tad overconfident here. But it's also here where we do get some insight into Jinho's strategy, which is kind of a questionable one, where we see Jinho getting the first minigame only for Hyunmin to get the second, and despite knowing that, Jinho still decides to get his partner to go all in, where I guess Jinho says it's part of his plan to just have his partner go all in whenever he sees a pair, which, why? And again, just in general, Jinho ends up playing this game very aggressively, and again, I get it in the sense that obviously they were not the most confident in these mini games. Though I feel like Jinho actually takes the wrong approach here, where it felt like he was either playing to win or lose, where I feel like Jinho is actually probably the only player of this bunch that could actually tried to play the middle. I actually feel like he could have just probably done nothing throughout this game and still not been picked for the death match. That's probably his actual more optimal path for safety at this point. But obviously, again, he ends up going for a more risky strategy here. But again, after round 10, we do see the players being able to change once again, though, again, what they decide after this round ends up sticking for the remaining 10 rounds. Right here, we do have seen Dongmin and Hyunmin deciding to do the minigames alongside Cordyceps and Jinho's partner, while Jinho and Kyunghoon end up playing Hold'em alongside Kyunghan and Dongmin's partner. Where again, at this point, we see Jinho essentially know that he's screwed because of him and his partner not doing well in the minigames. So Jinho says at this point that he's going all in no matter what. Which again, just felt like an unnecessary strategy, especially as, again, we see him go to round 11 where he just goes all in, which again, I'm assuming his plan was to get everyone to fold, and again, we see everyone fold here except for Kyunghan, which is funny considering Hyunmin literally told him not to do this, but he ends up doing it anyway, ends up working to their favor as Kyunghan ends up winning this hand with a straight of 9, 10, and 1, which I'll say I did not realize that 1 would count in this position, but obviously with this, Kyunghan ends up winning the hand, taking a pretty big lead. All Jinho ends up losing here, being the automatic deathmatch candidate, which again, just the reason why I think this was all pretty dumb. But also, really find this happens considering neither of their partners actually won any of the minigames, where it was Dongmin and Cordyceps that won, with Dongmin actually trying to help Jinho in this position, but again, Jinho ends up losing anyway. And again, just barely over halfway through the actual events of the game, we already know who deathmatch candidate is going to be, which leads to us really just speeding through the rest of the game, really just montaging through most of the hands. This spot where I did find it very funny they kicked out Jinho's partner from the minigame room, which is weird considering they didn't kick Jinho out of the poker tables. So again, why'd they kick him out of the minigame room? Where'd he go? But either way, we do get to the final round where everyone's strategy here is to go all in, which is again another aspect of this main match that's kind of lame in the fact that, yeah, just everyone's going to go all in. So again, really all that matters is you just surviving until this final round here, which again just makes Jinho's strategy even more ridiculous. But again, it all comes down to these final mini games where you see Cordyceps winning almost both of these, only for him to get the first one wrong and then proceed to miss out on the second one, barely to Hyungmin, where I guess Hyungmin's confidence finally worked out for him, and he ends up winning this main match, ultimately leaving with 99 garnets, while Dongmin only has 1, and then Jinho and Kyunghoon have 0, which is again a very funny disparity there. Obviously, Jinho ends up going to the death match and ends up picking Kyunghoon, which is pretty expected here. Probably the easiest person to beat in a death match, while also a person he has less of a connection with. Though obviously at this point we only have 2 games remaining, that being double-sided poker and 12 Jongi, to which we end up getting double-sided poker, which again, rules-wise, similar to last time, though again, another pretty good result here, really playing into this Kyunghoon storyline about being the Kingslayer, taking out Jinho in a poker game. And this match does end up going on for a while, with both playing pretty conservatively at first, though eventually Kyunghoon ends up betting on both sides, only to lose, putting him down 58-20, only for us to get to a point where they're tying over and over and over again, which again is pretty typical for Jinho, only for Jinho to end up losing his lead there. But again, it just continues to go on and on and on. For even when Kyunghoon ends up taking a bigger lead, Jinho still ends up winning some hands, but eventually Kyunghoon ends up pulling out the win here, ultimately getting a lot of credit for basing his folds on being able to see what the next card is in the box, and if it was low, he would fold to give Jinho a low top card, which again, innovative strat. I don't know how intentional this was from the producers. It didn't feel like this is something that they were meaning to happen. But it definitely worked to his favor. But ultimately, again, a game like double-side poker is still very luck-dependent. But this does end up being the 4th deathmatch win for Kyung-hoon, leaving us with an all-Season 3 Final 3, which includes 2 of that season's Final 2, which is funny. Also weird how it's 4 Season 1 players that go out in a row, where, again, at the time of the Final 7, they had the majority, only for them to all be out by the time of the Final 3. Also really funny to see Jinho go out in a poker game for the 2nd time in his career. Literally the 2 times that he goes out of the game is in a poker game, which is funny considering his career as a poker player. But again, that just adds to the more high variance aspect of these games. And with that, again, we lost Jinho. We do see Jinho seemingly being very disappointed as he leaves, saying sorry to the fans. They look forward to him, to where it does feel like Jinho kind of leaves the season being a bit disappointed with his appearance. And obviously, at the end of the day, this ends up being a more subdued appearance from Jinho, where obviously his first time around, while I think he was probably in the minority more on that season, he at least had obviously these big breakout moments. In season 2, he was actually the top dog for a lot of his run there, where it feels like this season's really one where he more so played a follower role and didn't really have any like big standout moments, to where I can kind of see how he feels that way, even though again he still obviously made it very deep into the game, and though again was clearly going to be outclassed by like Dongmin and Hyungmin by the end. But still, I mean, Jinho obviously is still this massive legend in the game, and to see him still have a, again, competent run here, I think is pretty satisfying for Grand Final. But then we get to episode 11. Obviously, the penultimate episode of the entire series, which is pretty insane, and one that I remember being very let down by at the time, even though, again, it has a very interesting death match. Though I think in retrospect, it's probably better than what I gave it credit for initially, even though I still have some qualms here, particularly with the presentation of the early portions of this episode. But the episode does start off with final 3 recaps, showing each of the relationships between each of these pairings of, again, which final 2 will we get? We'll get Kyung-hoon and Hyungmin being set up as having this frenemy dynamic. Always see Dongmin and Kyung-hoon, again, being the Kingslayer and the final king, which was clearly a more interesting storyline, along with obviously the rematch of Dongmin versus Hyungmin, where it is kind of insane just how close we got to the exact same final 2 as the previous season. Though obviously that does show how just skill-based the genius ends up being. But here we do have seeing Hyungmin coming in with a comically large pouch of garnets here, only for the dealer to end up collecting all the garnets, with the reveal that the prize money is now going to be the 100 garnets that are in the game, along with the 32 garnets that were taken from the eliminated players, giving a total prize of 132, over double of the prize money that was given out in seasons 2 and 3, and over 50 more than the prize money of season 1, where, while it's not the 200 that they said the game was designed for, I do think it's a pretty fair prize for a grand final, at least comparatively. But anyway, we get to what is the final main match in the Geniuses history, that being How Much? Which is a game that, again, I've always found to be a very lame final main match from the Genius. Not necessarily in the main mechanics of the game, where I actually think the game itself is, again, largely sound. My issues come from the fact that it's a game with guests. Guests that really hog up a lot of the screen time, with the guests here being the cast of SNL Korea, which is, again, just weird. Like, obviously it's just cross promotion, but it's weird that the Genius ends with the final main match being one that is just cross promotion, where I think I would like this a bit better if they kind of swapped out the guest spots here, had guests here be returning players. Oh, well, again, at the final 5, we got the SNL Korea cast. Again, it just feels weird that we're ending this like climactic season of the Genius with a lot of focus on comedians that don't know anything about the Genius. So again, the game itself is interesting here, it being a game where each guest is going to be asked about the price of 10 different products, and you are shown the total amount of money that was spent by each of these players for all 10 items, and across the rounds you have to deduce how much was the highest price offered for each item, with those being the closest to it without going over ends up winning, with you getting 1 point for rounds 1 through 7, 2 points for rounds 8 and 9, and 4 points for the final round, which obviously puts a lot more presence into those later rounds. Though really a lot of the intrigue really comes from these added mechanics beyond the basic guessing, where multiple players end up guessing the same amount. Their answers will be nullified, essentially adding in this like game of chicken, along with the fact that there's also an additional aspect that you can only spend a total of 200,000 over the course of this game, essentially making this game a much more complicated version of like Black and White 2, which again, I love Black and White 2, and I do think that's actually, again, what makes this game a lot more interesting than, again, interactions with the SNL Korea cast. As an additional aspect of this game is the fact that we get a very lengthy discussion with each guest each round, talking about each item, which just felt like an excuse for them to use these SNL people on the show, and a lot of the humor that ends up coming from the SNL Korea cast just really did not hit for me. And not much really comes from those segments, especially considering obviously they're told to not give concrete information, to where, well, you can glean some information from these conversations. It really ends up being a spot here that a lot of these conversations really just brought nothing to the show from my perspective. And again, we very rarely have information from this being utilized to solve the game, all while the actual important information that we get here ends up coming from the product order, and that the order that the items end up coming up in the game end up being from least to most in terms of total amount spent. You can get some information deduced there, while also each player gets a public and a private clue about each item, which is where they can ask about where a specific player ranks on that item, or check how much a certain guest spent, with all three getting one of those clues, while the other ends up being one that they can privately ask for. Where again, all in all, I think this is an interesting game. I think it's one that I probably would like it more if, again, it didn't revolve around this SNL cast and, again, the discussions with them. Though, to be fair, if you take that out of it, it's just a very basic game, and it's really just the players sitting there doing calculations before eventually bidding. Again, while not a bad game in its own right, I just think it's a tad underwhelming for, again, the final main match in the show's history. But anyway, with that, we get introduced to the SNL cast that, again, to me, just did not come off particularly funny, though, again, maybe it's just a cultural thing. But where, again, we get to talk about how funny it is that Sang-hun speaks Korean like he's speaking Chinese, haha. All Se-young does a Bruce Lee impersonation and also a Songbum impersonation, who, again, I don't know who that person is, but again, clearly it was very funny because even the dealer laughs for whatever reason. All the other three end up just not coming off super notable. Or Hakuso's only notable because he has a mustache. All we have Leah being tall and also just not seeming to know what show she's on. Jae-suk seems to be just very normal, but actually knows what show he's on. So, I mean, that's something. But again, we have the players and the guests being instantly separated, where Leah has to be explained the concept of the show. Oh, we also have Se-young simping over Hyungmin, only to find out he's only 21, which is also just a weird moment there. Oh, well, we also cut to the Genius players doing an impromptu skit. Which, why? Again, obviously it's SNL, but it's still, this is just, again, very weird for one of the final episodes of The Genius. But either way, the game eventually starts, where we spend so much time on this pointless back and forth between the players and the guests over how expensive or how cheap things are, where, again, just felt like a waste of time. And you would think there would at least be some fun banter in here, but there really just isn't. But anyway, round one's being for your phone bill, where they end up getting a public clue, asking about Se-young's ranking, with the reveal that she's first, which leads to obviously everyone asking for a price, where obviously everyone knows what they should be bidding here. Though I will say also very funny that to get their private clues, we see them literally having to text Bandage Man. But either way, obviously it all ends up becoming this game of chicken, with Hyungmin and Dongmin both end up using 1,000, the actual price it was going for, while Kyung-hoon ends up betting a set under it and winning. Where I do also find it very funny how this episode's portrayed, in that, again, it really portrays Kyung-hoon as this mastermind here for making this move, when it's this is the obvious move, where really actually it seemed like the other two actually had more critical thinking in this spot, actually banking on the fact that the others would make the obvious move that Kyung-hoon made, and that's why they went for exact amount. Now, either way, the next few rounds go pretty well for Dongmin, with him getting a question about tuition exactly right. Somehow, all in round 3, we have him having, again, another fairly accurate read of realizing that the highest price must be extremely high, where we see Hyungmin and Kyung-hoon both bid fairly low at 3,000, only for him to bet 10,000. And winning when the answer was actually 15,000, which, to be fair, is actually him wasting more money than he probably should have, which is obviously, again, another aspect of this game, again, similar to Black and White 2, where ideally you would win without spending much more than your opponents here. Now, round 4 has them bidding for being able to erase the memory of one day in your life, which I find it very funny how, a lot of these items are very concrete, and then you have, something like this. But again, this leads to poop humor. Dongmin joking about how Leah pooped her pants in high school because haha. But it's a pretty insane round, where we do see Hyungmin and Kyung-hoon both ending up bidding 15,000, which wasn't even the highest amount, leading to Dongmin knowing the highest amount, but instead offering 1 to not waste any more money, leading to him just completely lucking into a win here, where by the end of round 4, with him having 3 points, he's already in a position here to where he only needs to win that final round to go on to win the game, all while Hyungmin ends up being in a much more desperate position here with no points, leading to him being a bit more aggressive over these next few rounds, where in round 5, we do get them bidding for an iced Americano, which is insane that that's a round 5 pick. Where you see Dongmin and Hyungmin bidding very low. Hyungmin bids 25,000 and ends up winning, with Sang-hyun having bid $100,000 because it reminds him of how he met his wife, which is, again, insane. But obviously leads to a spot where Hyungmin wasted way more money than he should have. Take us to round 6, where, again, it's them bidding for meeting their favorite star in the world for an hour, where Se-young says her favorite star is Sam Smith, which felt very random. But it's another spot here where Hyungmin ends up winning, bidding 1,500, all while Kyunghoon and Dongmin bid very minuscule amounts. Though it does take us to round 7, where it is funny that we do see all the players here really debating if it's even worth going for this point, being the last 1 point round, or if you're just better off going for those final rounds, where Kyunghoon ends up only bidding 1. Oh, we see Dongmin, interesting bid 16,000, which felt like a bit of a waste. Though Hyungmin ends up wasting even more money here, 26,000, which ends up putting him in position to be tied with Dongmin coming into this round. But though it is in round 8 where you get a lot of focus around Kyunghoon, not even bothering listening to the discussions anymore, which I found really funny, but obviously more focused around his calculations, because again, surely he's going to have this mastermind moment at the end. Though again, funny that even he realized just how pointless the discussions end up being. But it's also here where we see Se-young doing her impersonation again, and the dealer breaking again, because I guess it's really funny. But it's surprising to see them all bidding fairly high amounts here, with Hyungmin and Kyunghoon going right below 50,000, all while Dongmin ends up being right below 60,000, ends up winning the point, which is funny that this is propped as like this big moment for Dongmin, with him clearly outplaying the others, when he actually seemed to be pretty annoyed that he won here, where it did seem like by this point he was already playing into his plan of specifically trying to get into a death match with Hyungmin. But in round 9, we do see them all playing fairly conservatively, with Kyunghoon and coming out with the point there, leading us into a final round where essentially the final round just determines the winner, as again, they're all in a position where if they win the final round, they win the game. So again, kind of lame. Though in the final round, you're not given any clues to determine the price there. Though it is here, we once again get a lot of focus on Kyunghoon calculating, with the reveal that he ends up getting the exact number at 100,000, being portrayed as this big moment that Kyunghoon had been getting the information on the same person from every round, and the person that spent the most amount of money, with the assumption they would obviously spend the most amount of money in the final round, with that leading him to this final amount, which again, good assumption. Mind you, it's still an assumption, where again, if you were wrong, this would play out disastrously. But also again, really funny how like it's portrayed as this big mastermind moment for Kyunghoon, when like both Dongmin and Hyungmin also knew the answer. Where again, it was kind of obvious it was going to end up being 100,000, which again is just kind of lame of this game. The fact that the final price here is again fairly obvious, to where it really just comes down to a final game of chicken that really just determines the final main match winner. Where again, we see Hyungmin putting a lower amount, thinking that the other two would tie, all while we see Dongmin putting a number right under the right amount, in the hopes that Kyunghoon would actually win, as he gives this monologue here, saying he's already made his choice for the death match. The only game he ever lost was 12 Jonggi against Hyungmin, and now it's time for him to challenge him again, which I'll say is a pretty badass moment there for Dongmin. But again, I think you can question like how intentional a lot of this is, and again, it's very difficult to truly game this game to lead to that result. At least sounds very good on paper, and is again very satisfying to the overall story of this season. Again, feeling as if it's scripted here for Dongmin and Hyungmin to face off again, and for Dongmin to avenge his only loss on his way to becoming the undisputed GOAT of the show, to where again, it is this great full circle moment that is largely dictated by the format of this season, where obviously like something a bit understated here is the fact that obviously Dongmin did all this because he knew what the final death match was. He knew it was 12 Jonggi, and again, they had known that 12 Jonggi was in the game for the entire season, where Dongmin supposedly vigorously prepared for it, which obviously gave him a lot more confidence in pulling off a move like this, as again, if he fails, he obviously comes off as a massive idiot, but because he succeeds, it probably leads to one of the most satisfying full circle moments across this entire season. But again, ends up being the typical 12 Jonggi, though with a few rule modifications here, which again, love that through the rule explanation here, we have Assassin's Creed 4 music playing once again, but though we do see them having a stricter turn timer here, which ups the difficulty, along with the fact that, strangely, it's a best out of 3, which again, hasn't happened before. So I don't know why they decided to do that here for a deathmatch. Either way, round 1 starts with Hyungmin seeming to use the same strategy that he was utilizing in Season 3, with Dongmin clearly having studied to counter this plan, and we see Hyungmin just waiting for Dongmin to make a mistake, only for that to never happen, and instead end up trapping Hyungmin's king, leading to Hyungmin making a mistake, and pressure for time, leading to Dongmin winning round 1. Take us to round 2, where at this point, Hyungmin tries to make moves that Dongmin can't read, leading to a very lengthy battle here with a lot of back and forth, with none of the moves being properly explained here, which again, probably criticism of the overall presentation of all this, but it ultimately ends up being a very climatic showdown here between the two. Again, getting to a point where both of them only have their kings on the board, yet Dongmin has the advantage there because he has both the ministers, which allow him to block out an entire row, only for Hyungmin to later make some moves that give him the advantage, to where Kyunghoon declares that he thinks he's won the game, only for Dongmin to make moves that neither were expecting, with him being able to get out of some tricky situations here. And I do really love this moment of this game's climax, where we have Dongmin in confessional saying that Hyungmin can't beat a prepared Dongmin, only for him to proceed to place his general in a spot that traps Hyungmin's king, to have the music swelling up and Hyungmin making a face realizing he's defeated, where I've always found that to be a really great moment here that really just pays off this Dongmin-Hyungmin relationship, with Dongmin outplaying Hyungmin Hyungmin once again, finally outplaying him in 12 Jongi in particular, and again, just really feeling like this moment of Dongmin just completely schooling Hyungmin at his best game here, which leads to Hyungmin's loss, with him being extremely emotional on his way out, which was a bit of a different Hyungmin to see here. So again, with that, we lose Hyungmin, who, again, had a very strange run on the season. Obviously, still very strong. I mean, Hyungmin in Season 3 obviously came off as the best to never win. Probably just in that season alone, right, was stronger than both of the winners from the previous 2 seasons. Yeah, in this appearance here, he's still very good, though obviously there are just more moments where he kind of gets outplayed across this season. It feels like this is a season where he came in with a lot of confidence, and not necessarily all that ends up being founded by the end, yet it does still feel like a spot here where he is clearly a very talented player, again, getting all the way to the final 3 once again, having a very impressive record, again, a 2nd place appearance and a 3rd place appearance on a game, again, as skill-based as the Genius, yet I do think his hubris got the best of him at points, though he still demonstrated a lot of skill here to where he's clearly still the best to never win. But with that, we get to episode 12, the final episode of The Genius, and it ends up being one that, again, kind of like the season as a whole, maybe isn't the greatest episode on paper, definitely a tad underwhelming from a results perspective, in the sense that it essentially ends up being a blowout, but still ends up being a pretty satisfactory final episode for the show as a whole, one that really feels like it celebrates the history of the show, one that obviously culminates in this declaration of this King of Kings, while also feeling like a pretty solid farewell to the series as a whole. But it all starts off with, again, some kind of boring content, mostly revolving around Dongmin and Kyunghoon, talking about their life stories, and also we get footage from their initial reactions to seeing each other in the Season 3 preseason, which again, finally they did this exact same thing with Dongmin and Hyungmin in Season 3, but obviously again, the main storyline here ends up being about can Kyunghoon actually be the Kingslayer and take down the final king, which very quickly find out, no he can't. Anyway, we obviously have the eliminated players coming back here, with actually everyone being here for the only time in the show's history, which again, at least fitting for the final season to finally get that accomplished. Again, we do get some humor from Junghan coming in last and just being embarrassed about being the first boot. Oh, we see Sangmin. Oh, we get a pretty touching moment here of Sangmin leading the group and holding hands along with the dealers and going around in a circle and saying thank you to the series, which again, touching, though won't be the last time they do it. But then we get to the final 2 interviews, where I did find it very funny how this actually felt very Survivor coded, where I feel like in the previous seasons these felt very ho-hum, didn't really lead to much. Yet here we actually see Kyungran calling out Dongmin for asking him if he knew about the hidden cube during Minus Auction, which felt like a moment at a Survivor Final Tribal where someone would ask if you were involved in that person's elimination. Oh, we have Kyunghoon continuing to play into this Kingslayer narrative, again also feeling very Survivor coded and trying to sell your story. Though it's interesting to see here that Kyunghoon does end up actually getting the majority of the votes here, getting Sangmin's as expected, while also getting a lot of the outsiders as well. People like Yohwan and Yoonsung and Junseok, who he supposedly had breakfast with earlier that day, all also getting Yuhyun and Youngmin's votes, with them obviously having similar backgrounds coming from the audition process. Though, to be fair, I feel like Youngmin's also felt like him being a tad bitter of him saying that, with him mentioning that Dongmin was the most responsible for getting him out. Oh, we see Dongmin get expected ones like Jinho and Kyungran, all getting Jungmoon and Junghyun, who didn't seem to have a particularly vested interest. But probably the more surprising vote here ends up coming from Yunsung, who ends up being one of the only non-Dongmin supporters in Season 3. So again, funny that he turns around to support Dongmin here. Though again, he also felt a tad bitter here, talking about how he's voting for Dongmin because he's helped Kyunghoon out a lot already. But anyway, we obviously get the rules being explained, which again, similar format to the previous seasons. Best out of 3 death matches. Though interestingly, in comparison to previous seasons, where typically the first and third death matches are games already used, and a player gets an advantage to pick which one they do first, although the middle game is a new game, this season instead has 2 new games, both of them being the first 2 death matches to guarantee that they're played. Boy, did they need that. While the final game ends up being the return of betting black and white, which again kind of makes sense why it wasn't used beforehand, where again I felt like them trying to change things up, make all the final matches here new, which I'm kind of mixed opinions on. I mean, I do think for a grand final, again, it kind of makes sense here. I don't really have any true major qualms with this, though again, just feels weird that again this is obviously the first time they do it, where every other season had this set format they went against here. But either way, the first match we end up seeing of the day ends up being again a new game here, Number Jongi, with again Assassin's Creed 4 music playing, both in the background during the explanation, but also throughout the entire match, which again just really threw me off. But again, it's an interesting modification of 12 Jongi just on a much bigger scale, given a much bigger board, but also the addition here that opponents can't see what your pieces are. All you also having 14 total pieces. First piece is getting a king, 3 mines, and numbers 1 through 10, where obviously the goal of this game is similar to other Jongi style games of just defeating the other team's king or getting your king to the opposite side. Though the interesting aspect of this game is that if you move your piece next to an enemy's piece, they will proceed to battle, with the numbers of your piece and your enemy's piece being added together, unless your space is in between a minus sign, which again they're subtracted instead, which can lead to varying results here. Something I do like about this game is the fact that it's not a simple battle of just who has the higher number as you would expect, but instead the results differ based on what numbers are utilized here, where if the sum ends up being more than 10, then the higher number ends up winning here. All if the sum ends up being less than 10, then the lower number winners here. Obviously adding a lot more variance here to these pieces, not just making a simple 10 beats everything, even though 2 fair makes it very likely that a 10 and a 1 beats almost everything, but still, again, it definitely adds a lot more variety here, making it so each piece is not this like end all be all. Also, again, with the addition of minus battles, just again adds a lot of variety to this game, especially as there's more variety beyond that, where again we have mines, where if you end up battling with a mine, your piece automatically blows up. Though an interesting caveat to that is the fact that mines can't move, which adds some level of strategy there. Where I always really like this game, and I think it's a shame that we only saw it play out once. In terms of items for this game, we do have a blind item, which allows you to hide a piece's number after one battle, which again, helpful, but not to any ridiculous degree. Oh, well, we also have minus and +1 items, with Dongmin end up getting the -1 and the blind item, all while Kyunghoon ends up getting the +1. Where I would say that's something that kind of plays maybe against Kyunghoon in this, to where despite the fact that Kyunghoon ends up having the majority of the items coming into these death matches, it does seem like he had more items related to the final game than these first 2 games, with Dongmin actually getting more items for first 2 games that, again, to be fair, wouldn't have played that much of a factor anyway, but definitely something that kind of nullifies that advantage that you would think he would have from having more items. But again, we do end up seeing the players being able to practice with their supporters, where weirdly we do see like Dongmin here with Jinho and Yunsung in a spot where Yunsung doesn't even speak the entire time they're shown and just sits there and doesn't say a word. While Kyunghoon ends up getting Yuyan and Hyunmin to help him. But either way, the game ends up starting here with Kyunghoon ends up playing very passively here, just waiting at the start, moving his piece back and forth, seeming to try to figure out where the mines are before moving, which seems like a fine strat, though ultimately, again, there's so many pieces on the board that you're not really incentivized to move that many pieces early on, so it's not like you get that much out of this. But either way, we do see Dongmin being the first to attack, only for really the rest of the game being spots where Kyunghoon comes off very confident, only to be a bit undermined following that. Following this, Kyunghoon's left in a pretty desperate position with very few pieces left on the board, literally just having his 10 and his king as the only movable pieces, allowing for Dongmin to just easily win by the end. Though at least a fairly even match here, one where if Kyunghoon had just guessed the correct piece as the king, he could have definitely won here, but and does leave Kyunghoon not deterred coming out of this, as he feels confident betting black and white. And he just needs to win that second game, which quickly will become very obvious that he's not going to be winning that second game with how little time there is left in the episode. But the final new game we see in the history of the Genius ends up being Mystery Sign, a game where you are given 2 numbers and you have to solve the equation for those 2 numbers, where to get hints towards that, each finalist will end up naming a number, get the answer to that equation using the same formula. Sort of game ends up functioning similarly to like same number hunt, or to hit your buzzer, and if you get it right, you get a point. If you're wrong, you lose. Again, typical fair there. And in general, a really good game. It's actually a game that I think later inspired a lot of like future survival games, where we see games kind of similar to this on other shows. But it ends up being a very complicated game here, one that, while there are certain solutions that aren't the hardest in the world, there are some that are very abstract that become very difficult to piece together, though. Again, the items that are utilized for this are, again, not that dissimilar from what we've seen in previous finals. Again, things like double score and no lost points, with Dongmin getting both of those, while Kyunghoon ends up getting a secret, which is a more unique power here, allowing him to pick a number for one of the hints secretly, though, again, not really a massive advantage there. But we do see Kyunghoon starting off pretty well here, guessing the first answer right away, with Junsuk saying it'll be too easy if that's it, which it turns out to be right. Again, literally just being 2 times the first number minus the second number. Though in a spot where we do see Yohwan being very confused here, with Yuhyun having to explain it to him, which again, not a great look for Yohwan once again. By the time around 2, we do see Dongmin starting to utilize a strategy of using higher numbers to make it harder to calculate, giving him more time here, where it did feel like a spot here where Kyunghoon definitely had an advantage. It was just basic arithmetic, while Dongmin had more of an advantage for these more abstract ones, though he ends up getting it correct here, it being again the sum followed by the difference, which again, just kind of basic, though again, Yohwan is still confused by all this. But it is a spot here where you do see that Dongmin end up having a pretty decent decent advantage here by being able to pick his number second, as obviously in that position, you would already know what number you're going to pick, and you can do some quick calculations for that before you say your number, which did give him the advantage in this round in particular that led to him winning this point. But anyway, round 3 has Dongmin winning once again here, with it simply just being the remainder, again giving him a lead, all where we get to round 4 where Kyung-hoon uses his secret finally and figures it out after the second hint to refocus on Kyung-hoon being prepared his buzzer at the first opportunity, only for Dongmin to beat him to it and getting it right, with Dongmin really starting to run away with this, where again it's in this moment where you do start to realize that, oh, I think the genius is over. But we get to round 5 where Dongmin ends up using both of his double and no points items here, only for Kyung-hoon to disable his double, as again at that point it would be pretty insurmountable for him to go on to win. This ends up probably being the most impressive round of this game here, where we do start off with, again, a very funny moment of the eliminated players here joking about how Kyung-hoon should be picking a very high number, a number in the 100,000s or millions, only for him to proceed to pick a number in the billions, which is just ridiculous. And again, really funny, they end up showing the result of the equation so small on the screen that you can barely see it, though. We do proceed to see Dongmin just utilizing that same number for the following hints, as obviously that's what he's already started using his calculations for, to which we end up noticing quite often the numbers 2111 at the end, which is obviously a massive hint to the pattern here. Dongmin piecing it together, that showing the unique numbers in order followed by the counts of those numbers, which is a pretty abstract equation here, obviously taking away from the more arithmetic based ones that we had seen previously, and again it being something that definitely favors Dongmin here more than Kyung-hoon, though again putting Dongmin in a pretty commanding lead here of 4-1, where we do get Fallout Boy playing in typical Dongmin fashion as he gets this point. But following this, we do see Kyung-hoon making a bit of a comeback here, where in round 6 and 7 he's able to get both of those points, getting them fairly quickly in a spot where he was clearly rushing at this point to avoid Dongmin from getting to answer, and him also feeling like he needs to get the rest correct considering how far behind he is, where it does lead to him faltering around 8, with him getting it wrong initially only to get it right, leaving him still at 4-3 coming into round 9, with him proceeding to get it wrong once again and Dongmin proceed to get it right, where this is the point where the game really felt like it was over, and even the show starts to portray it as it's over, where again it's 5-2 with only 2 rounds remaining, meaning that Dongmin literally can just do nothing for the next 2 rounds and the game is literally done. So reducing the dealer, literally giving Kyung-hoon the option of conceding, which, to be fair, would have been fairly lame if he did, though thankfully he ends up continuing on despite it feeling like a losing battle at this point, where I did love coming into round 10 where we do get the typical genius sort of editing of the show trying to make you think like it's completely over, only for Dongmin to decide to answer anyway and solidify his win, only for him to be wrong, giving Kyung-hoon an opportunity here where again at this point if he gets the next 2 questions right, he could potentially tie, and I would say if Dongmin ended up losing, because this would have looked like a really astronomically dumb move, but it's all for naught as Dongmin ends up getting it right eventually anyway, with it now officially being over, Dongmin getting the final question right as well, culminating in a 6-2 victory. Dongmin becoming a 2-time winner of the show, an extremely dominant winner of the show, and really the undisputed GOAT of the show, which I think is an incredible ending to the series. While again, I probably would have preferred us getting a round 3, and to be fair, I think there are merits to a Kyung-hoon win as well, again, this Kingslayer storyline. I do think having such a dominant performance here from Dongmin to wrap up the show's history and really solidify Dongmin's legacy really just adds to the appeal of this ending, where I do think the fact that he just demolishes Kyung-hoon in this final here really just further adds to the story of Dongmin in my mind, where while again it probably is not the most optimal outcome specifically for this episode itself, I do think it adds to the story of the season, adds to the story of the genius as a whole. And I really do love the ending of this episode, where again it's something that I do find fairly emotional. I mean, The Genius is a show that again I think is potentially the best reality show of all time, specifically in the way that it's edited, the way that you feel connected to this cast despite it's literally just them playing games on a set. But again, I think this season really pays off the series in a very satisfying way, where we do get the song Don't Look Back in Anger by Oasis playing, which is a song that kind of lingers in my mind as like sort of bittersweet song when I think about things ending, where again we get this like final celebration here with the players coming out and declaring Dongmin the King of Kings, all while we have Sangmin leading them all and holding hands once again and going around the circle, with us getting brief confessionals from each of the players to say farewell to the show. And again, it just feels like the show's actually over, and it culminates in this final shot of the 3 winners at the top of the stairs joking around about how they think the show will call them again, all while we have farewell coming on screen. And again, it's just such a bittersweet ending here, and one that again I think is pretty perfect for what it is. I do think The Genius is again a show show that, well, obviously, ideally, I would like more of, especially if it was able to maintain the quality that it had. I kind of also feel very content in the show ending in the way that it did. I feel like, again, culminating in Dongmin's win, I think is a very satisfying ending to the season. I think also culminating in this all-star season that felt like a satisfying payoff to the previous 3 seasons was a cool way to end. Now, again, is the season in its own right the strongest? I don't think so. Personally, I do think there are certain games that just are not as interesting as others. I think season 3 probably was the peak of the series' game design. I think seasons 1 and 2 are probably the peak of the series' character interactions. And I feel like season 4 doesn't really hit on either of those levels yet. I think what it does hit on is it being a full-on celebration of the show's run. And I do think the way it pays off storylines, the way it really celebrates the series is something that I think is to be commended. And obviously now we're in a spot where, again, some other countries have tried out the Genius formula and haven't really had that same level of success. And we've had other Korean shows attempt to do what the Genius did to varying success. So I do think it leaves me just largely content with how the Genius ends here. Again, it's a spot where I would be worried if it were to come back, as again, I think there's a high potential that it would just simply just not be as good as what it used to be. Oh, we have shows like, again, The Devil's Plan and Bloody Game that feel like competent enough successors. Again, not as good as the Genius in my point of view, but again, at least shows that feel like they take the Genius formula and try to do something with it, to where, again, as a whole, I do think Genius Grand Final here ends up being a fairly satisfying conclusion to the series. But before wrapping up the video, we obviously got to talk about the final 2 still, starting it off with Kyung-hoon. And Kyung-hoon's obviously a player here that came into this season with a very, memeable perception, just kind of being this very chaotic, erratic player, and he obviously continues that on this season. So obviously, by the end, ends up showing a lot more game ability than he did his first appearance, where obviously he ends up blowing up the game during Fruit Stand and gets sniped out immediately after that. This time we get to see more of him. Him still, again, being a mess at points, though still having some good moments. Again, Garnet Thief, him leading to a 5-way joint win, him having, again, 4 deathmatch wins. Now, ultimately, again, he just simply was not good enough to defeat Dongmin at the end. Yeah, I do think he definitely demonstrated a lot of decent game ability on this season, especially in death matches, which again is fundamentally the most important aspect of winning the show. And I thought was a fun enough character on this season. I know some people get annoyed of Kyung-hoon, and I could definitely see that, especially considering he just comes off as a very odd person. But I do think he ended up making for some pretty good TV here, really making up a lot of the more fun character interactions from the season and some of the more confounding gameplay decisions across the season that, again, definitely makes him probably the main standout from this season, which, again, is surprising considering how low of a reputation he had coming into this season. But then we also have, again, the King of Kings. We have Dongmin, and that was, again, just such a dominant performance here from Dongmin. It really feels like Dongmin took his season from season 3 and really just improved upon that in every single way. Still remained this leader in the main matches while also demonstrating a lot of deathmatch ability and not really having this major point where he makes a critical mistake that costs him the game, where I feel again this feels like such a satisfying payoff to his storyline. Really feeling like he perfects every aspect of his game, and mind you, obviously, again, the format definitely helped him with that. Again, this being a format that you knew what death matches were to come, that allowed him to practice for all the death matches. He's obviously just such a naturally skilled player, and one that has now been able to dominate 2 seasons of the Genius. Literally half of the show's run is dominated by Dongmin, and while I actually do feel like he was probably a lesser character on this season, he obviously still had his fair share of decent moments here, and obviously ends up being, again, kind of the undisputable GOAT of the show, with him even being able to later prove that in other survival shows as well, with him, again, just really having this incredible knack for these style of games, which really leaves, again, Dongmin winning at the end here and really just further setting him apart from the rest of the field. Really just ends up being this very satisfying conclusion to the series as a whole. And with that, those are my opinions on the Genius Grand Final. Again, a season that I do love as much as I love every other Genius season, though as a whole, I do have somewhat more conflicted opinions on it from a modern perspective, where I'm personally still unsure where exactly I would rank this season amongst the Genius seasons nowadays, which, to be fair, I just a tough time rankings at all nowadays, as I do feel like my general opinions on the seasons are vastly different than even the last time I did a season ranking, where I believe the last time I did a season ranking, I had this season at number 1. However, I do think there's an argument this is actually probably my least favorite Genius season at this point, where while there's a lot of things I do respect from the season, again, especially in how it correlates back to the previous seasons, I do think as its own individual season, it's probably lacking in some of the things that really make the Genius special to me. Not having as many big reveals, not having as fun gameplay moments, especially in the back half of the season, and just simply not being as consistent of a ride as previous seasons, to where, again, I do think my overall respect for this season's probably gone down through the rewatch, but again, it's still a Genius season. It's still one of the best review seasons of all time, and still a satisfying final season for the series, but just a season that I probably have a lower opinion of nowadays, even though it's a season that has a lot of strong suits as well. But there we go. I mean, that's pretty much all my opinions on the Genius Grand Final. And with that, that's the end of these Genius retrospectives. Again, I have done retrospectives on all 4 seasons of the Korean show. Now, obviously, there are the international iterations I could potentially do videos on, though I'll be honest, I'm not really clamoring to do those in the near future, even though, again, I do think I have a fair amount of stuff to say about Genius UK, and obviously, again, I did actually initially intend on making a video on that, and again, considering this video is obviously coming out very, very late, you kind of assume why I ultimately end up having to cancel that video. But still, I would say never for a video at some point down the road, though again, nothing currently planned. Though even though I'm done doing these Genius retrospectives, I'm not opposed to doing more Genius related videos down the road. I do have a main match and death match ranking planned for some point in the future. I would like to do maybe a ranking of every episode at some point as well, and maybe there's some other ideas I can come up with where ultimately, again, while this Genius retrospective series is done, again, there's other ideas out there that maybe I'll eventually do, so stay tuned for those things. But for now, again, as the final Genius retrospective, my retrospective of the Genius Grand Final, thank you for watching.